Hi everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Evan Crime Stories. If you're listening as you fall asleep, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. And if you enjoy the story, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. Tonight's story involves real people and real tragedies. We share it to remember the victims and learn from the warning signs. Story 1. June 6, 1992. Springfield, Missouri. For most people in the city, it was an ordinary summer weekend. But for three women, that night would become the beginning of a mystery that has lasted more than 3 decades. Their names were Cheryl Levitt, her 19-year-old daughter Suzanne Streeter, and Suzanne's 18-year-old friend Stacy McCall. Today, all three are still missing. The FBI officially records June 7, 1992, as the date of their disappearance. According to the FBI, Suzanne and Stacy had attended graduation parties the night before and later returned to Cheryl's home in Springfield. The three disappeared from that house sometime between approximately 2:15 a.m. and 7:30 a.m. But when this story began, nobody knew that. There was no dramatic warning, no public announcement, no obvious sign that something terrible was happening. Just an ordinary night. Suzanne Streeter had just graduated from high school. Stacy McCall had graduated too. For two teenagers, graduation was supposed to mark the beginning of something new. A new chapter, a summer full of possibilities, friends, plans, and the excitement that comes with finishing school. On the evening of June 6th, Suzanne and Stacy attended graduation celebrations with friends. Later that night, the two young women decided to spend the night at Suzanne's home. Suzanne lived with her mother, Cheryl Levitt, in a house on East Delmar Street in Springfield. The plan seemed simple. They would go home, they would sleep, and the next day would continue normally. But that normal day never came. According to the FBI, Suzanne and Stacy were last known to have been at the house after returning from the graduation parties. Their disappearance window began at approximately 2:15 a.m. and extended to 7:30 a.m. That 5-hour window would eventually become one of the most important parts of the entire investigation, because somewhere inside those hours, 3 people vanished, and almost nothing was left behind to explain where they went. Cheryl Levitt was 47 years old. She was Suzanne's mother. She was also the person whose home would become the center of the investigation. Cheryl was not supposed to disappear that night. There was no known reason for her to leave suddenly. And when investigators later examined the house, her belongings were still there. The same was true for Suzanne and Stacy. Their personal belongings remained behind. Their vehicles remained behind. The scene did not look like 3 people had simply decided to leave town together. That distinction would become extremely important, because if 3 people voluntarily left during the night, investigators would expect some indication of that decision. A planned trip, clothing, money, personal items, a vehicle, some kind of communication. Instead, the evidence suggested something very different. The women were simply gone. The FBI states that the 3 have not been seen or heard from since that morning, and that is where the mystery begins. Imagine the house that morning. It is quiet. The night before had been filled with graduation celebrations. Young people had been out celebrating. There had been laughter, cars on the road, conversations, plans for the next day, and then suddenly, silence. At some point during the early morning hours, something happened inside or around that house. Something changed the lives of 3 families forever, but nobody outside the house appears to have understood what was happening at the time. There was no immediate emergency call, no confirmed eyewitness to an abduction, no confirmed sighting of the 3 women leaving together, and no clear explanation. By morning, people began to realize something was wrong. Stacy had plans, Suzanne had plans, and neither woman was where she was expected to be. The concern grew. People tried calling. There was no answer. Eventually, family members and friends went to the house, and what they found was deeply unsettling. The women were missing, but their things were still there. That is one of the details that has made this case so haunting for investigators and the public. If 3 people leave voluntarily, they normally take something with them. A purse, a wallet, keys, clothing, a vehicle, something. But in this case, the women left behind the ordinary objects of their lives. The objects that suggested they had not planned to disappear. Their vehicles were still at the residence. Their personal belongings were still there. The FBI's missing person alert confirms that Suzanne and Stacy had returned to Levitt's home after the graduation celebrations, and that all three disappeared from that location during the early morning window. That raised a disturbing possibility. Perhaps they had not left willingly. Perhaps someone had come to the house. Perhaps someone had forced them to leave. Or perhaps something else had happened that investigators still did not understand. There was no easy answer. The house itself became the first major mystery. Investigators did not discover a scene that immediately explained what had happened. Instead, the home appeared strangely quiet. There was no obvious, dramatic struggle. No clear scene that immediately identified an attacker. No bodies. No confirmed murder weapon. No obvious explanation. The official case information describes the home as appearing to indicate that the women had been abducted. That meant investigators were faced with an unusual problem. They knew where the women had last been, but they did not know where they had gone, and they did not know who had taken them. If someone had abducted 3 women from the house, that person had somehow managed to do it without leaving behind enough evidence to immediately reveal their identity. That alone was extraordinary. 3 people, 1 house, 1 night, and almost no explanation. There was another detail that would later become part of the mystery. The porch light. A broken globe was reported at the residence. It was not enough to solve the case, but in an investigation where so few physical clues existed, even small details attracted attention. Was it broken during an ordinary accident? Did someone strike it? Was it connected to the disappearance? Nobody could establish a definitive answer. Then there was the telephone answering machine. At some point, a message had reportedly been left, but that message was later erased. That meant investigators potentially lost information that might have helped reconstruct what happened. The exact significance of the erased message has been debated for years. But from an investigative perspective, the loss was frustrating, because in a case built around a narrow window of time, even a small piece of communication could have mattered. A voice, a name, a time, a background sound, anything. But once the message was erased, that potential evidence was gone, and the mystery became even deeper. By June 7th, Springfield police were dealing with an extraordinary missing person investigation. 3 women had disappeared from the same home. Not 3 strangers. A mother, her daughter, and her daughter's close friend. The Springfield Police Department case number would become 92 to 40,169. The FBI later included all 3 women in its VICAP missing person system. Their names were recorded. Their photographs were circulated. Descriptions were created. Investigators began searching for answers. But there was a problem. They did not know exactly what they were searching for. A missing person investigation normally begins with a last known location. That part was clear. But then investigators needed direction. A vehicle. A witness. A destination. A suspect. Something. Here, the last known location was the house. And after that, nothing certain. No confirmed destination. No confirmed sighting. No confirmed explanation. Only a disappearance window of several hours. Think about that window. 2:15 in the morning. 7:30 in the morning. 5 hours. Somewhere inside that period, the lives of 3 people changed forever. The FBI continues to list the disappearance as occurring between those approximate times. But investigators have never been able to publicly reconstruct every minute. What happened at 2:20? What happened at 3 o'clock? What happened at 4 o'clock? What happened just before sunrise? And most importantly, when did the women actually leave the house? Those questions have never received a complete answer. That is why the Springfield 3 case remains so compelling. It is not simply a mystery about where 3 people went. It is a mystery about what happened during a short period when almost everything should have been ordinary. Suzanne was 19. Stacy was 18. They had just completed high school. Their disappearance happened immediately after one of the biggest milestones of their young lives. Graduation. That makes the timing especially haunting. They should have been looking toward the future. Instead, their futures stopped. Cheryl was 47. She should have continued living her life, watching her daughter grow, seeing where Suzanne's life would lead. But that future disappeared too. 3 people, 3 separate lives, 1 house, 1 night, 1 unexplained disappearance, and no confirmed sighting afterward. As the first day continued, the search expanded. Friends were questioned. Family members were interviewed. Investigators examined the house. People began asking what could possibly have happened. Was it a voluntary disappearance? An abduction? Something personal? Something random? Was one person responsible? Were several people involved? Was the answer connected to someone the women knew? Or had a stranger entered their lives? Every possibility had to be considered. But speculation could not replace evidence. Investigators needed facts. And in the beginning, there were very few. That would become the defining problem of the case. The longer the investigation continued, the more theories appeared. But theories are easy. Proof is difficult. There was also another disturbing fact. If the women had been abducted, someone had to transport them. That meant a vehicle, a road, a destination, and a person capable of moving 3 people without immediately attracting attention. Investigators therefore had to think beyond the house. They had to think about the surrounding streets, the surrounding neighborhoods, possible vehicles, possible witnesses, and possible sightings. The question became, did anyone see anything unusual that morning? A strange vehicle, a person walking, a car leaving the neighborhood, a light turning on, a door opening, a sound. Anything could matter. But witnesses often do not realize the importance of what they see until afterward. A vehicle passing at 3 in the morning may mean nothing on an ordinary night. After 3 people disappear, it becomes important. That is the difficulty with investigations. The world does not stop and announce. This moment will become evidence. People only understand the importance later. And that is exactly what happened with the Springfield 3. People remembered things. Some reports emerged. Some leads appeared. Some theories became public. But none produced the answer. The investigation continued. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. And eventually years. The women did not return. No confirmed remains were found. No final explanation emerged. And the disappearance became one of the most enduring mysteries in Missouri. Today, the FBI still lists the 3 women as missing. Their names remain in the official records. Their case remains unsolved. And the question remains exactly where it began. What happened inside that house between the early morning hours of June 7, 1992? Because somewhere inside those 5 hours, the Springfield 3 disappeared. And the next chapter of this story begins with the people who first realized that something was terribly wrong. Morning came to Springfield, Missouri, just as it did every other summer day. But inside the Levitt home, something was wrong. 3 women were gone. Cheryl Levitt, her daughter, Suzanne Streeter, and Suzanne's friend, Stacy McCall. The FBI places their disappearance sometime between 2:15 a.m. and 7:30 a.m. on June 7, 1992. Suzanne and Stacy had returned to Cheryl's home after attending graduation parties the previous night. At first, however, nobody knew that this was going to become a disappearance case. It began with something much simpler. Someone expected the women to be there, and they weren't. The morning after graduation should have been quiet. Suzanne was 19. Stacy was 18. They had just finished high school. The previous evening had been about celebrating. Friends, graduation, the excitement of finishing one stage of life and beginning another. Nobody expected that by morning, their families would be searching for them. Nobody expected their names to eventually appear on missing person posters. And nobody expected that more than 30 years later, investigators would still be asking the same basic question. Where did they go? When people began checking the house, one of the strangest things was immediately apparent. There were no obvious signs that the 3 women had packed for a trip. They had not prepared to disappear for days. There was no clear indication that they had simply decided to leave together. Instead, the house contained the belongings of people who appeared to have expected to remain there. That detail would become central to the investigation, because if the women had willingly left, investigators needed to understand why. And if they had not left willingly, then someone else had to explain their disappearance. The vehicles became another important part of the mystery. The FBI's official missing person material identifies the three women as having disappeared from Cheryl's home, and the case remains listed as a Springfield Police Department investigation. Case number 92 to 40,169. Investigators now had a location. They had three missing people, and they had a narrow period of time. But they still lacked something essential, a confirmed direction. There was no confirmed destination, no confirmed sighting after they were believed to have returned home, no confirmed explanation for why all three would disappear at once. That made the case unusual from the beginning. As the morning progressed, concern grew. Friends wanted to know where Suzanne and Stacy were. Family members wanted answers, and investigators began trying to reconstruct the previous night. Where had Suzanne and Stacy gone? Who had they seen? Who had spoken with them? When had they returned? Who could confirm that they were actually inside the house after the graduation celebrations? Every minute mattered, because the longer investigators could establish the timeline, the smaller the window for whatever happened afterward would become. The FBI continues to identify the last known location as Cheryl Levitt's home, and the disappearance window as approximately 2:15 a.m. to 7:30 a.m. That means investigators were looking at the early morning hours, a time when most of Springfield was asleep, a time when streets were quieter, a time when there were fewer witnesses, and that may have helped whoever was responsible. But there was another problem. The house did not immediately tell investigators exactly what had happened. There was no clear, universally accepted explanation. No simple scene that answered everything. Instead, investigators were left with small details. Details that might mean something, or might mean nothing. A broken porch light globe. An answering machine message that was reportedly erased. Personal belongings left behind. And three people who were suddenly nowhere to be found. Each detail raised another question. None provided the answer. The broken porch light became one of those details. A damaged light fixture might be completely innocent. A household accident, an ordinary break. But in a disappearance case, investigators have to ask whether something more happened. Was it damaged during a struggle? Did someone hit it? Was it broken before the disappearance? Or did it have absolutely nothing to do with the case? Without definitive evidence, nobody could say. That is the frustrating nature of cold cases. A clue can look important without actually being connected. Investigators have to resist the temptation to turn every strange detail into a theory. They have to determine what can be proven. Then there was the answering machine. Imagine how valuable a recording from those early morning hours could have been. A voice, a background noise, a name, a conversation. Even a few seconds of audio might have provided investigators with something. But a message was reportedly erased. And once it was gone, whatever information it contained was gone with it. That became another unanswered question. Who left the message? Why was it erased? Who erased it? And was it connected to the disappearance? There is no definitive public answer to those questions. But the possibility of lost information adds another layer to the case. By now, investigators had to consider the most serious possibility. The women may have been abducted. The FBI's current case information continues to treat the disappearance as a missing person case and asks anyone with information to contact investigators. If an abduction had occurred, investigators needed to understand how. 3 women were in one home. If someone entered, how did that happen? Did the women know the person? Were they surprised? Were they threatened? Was there more than one person? And how were 3 people moved without creating enough noise or attracting enough attention to immediately reveal what was happening? These questions were difficult, but they were necessary. There was another possibility. Perhaps the 3 women knew the person who came to the house. That would change everything. A stranger entering a home at 3 in the morning is one thing. A familiar person arriving is something else. Someone the women trusted might have been allowed inside. Someone they knew might not have caused immediate alarm. But investigators could not simply assume that happened. They needed evidence, and that meant examining the women's relationships. Friends, acquaintances, neighbors, former partners. family connections, people they had met during the graduation celebrations, and anyone who knew where Cheryl lived. The investigation would eventually have to examine a large circle of people. But the first challenge was reconstructing that final night. Suzanne and Stacy had been celebrating their graduation. That meant there were potentially many people who had seen them during the evening. That was helpful, because every confirmed sighting could establish part of the timeline. Someone might remember seeing them at a party. Someone else might remember them leaving. Another person might remember what time they arrived at the Levitt home. And eventually, those pieces could create a timeline. But there was a limit. The important period began after they were believed to have returned home. And during those early morning hours, there were far fewer people awake. That created a gap where the most important events may have happened. The investigation, therefore, became a search for that missing period. The women were there. Then they weren't. What happened in between? That simple question became the center of everything. And because there were 3 women, investigators also had to ask whether all 3 disappeared at exactly the same time. Perhaps one disappeared first. Perhaps another followed. Perhaps the women were taken together. Perhaps they were separated. There was no confirmed public reconstruction. The uncertainty remained. As the first days passed, the case began receiving attention. 3 women disappearing from the same home was impossible to ignore. The families wanted answers. Friends wanted answers. The community wanted answers. And investigators needed information. The women were entered into missing person systems. Photographs were circulated. Descriptions were recorded. The official FBI VCAP alert lists. Cheryl E. Levitt, 47. Suzanne E. Streeter, 19. Stacy K. McCall, 18. The photographs would eventually become familiar to people across the country. But photographs cannot tell investigators where someone went. They can only remind the public who is missing. And that was the heartbreaking part. 3 faces, 3 names, 3 families waiting, but no confirmed location, no phone call, no verified sighting, no message from the women. Nothing that could tell investigators whether they were alive or dead. As days turned into weeks, hope remained. At first, families could still imagine many possibilities. Maybe they had left voluntarily. Maybe they were somewhere else. Maybe they would return. Maybe someone would call. Maybe they had been found. But as time passed without contact, those possibilities became harder to maintain. The investigation became more serious. And the question became darker. What if they never came back? Yet there was still no definitive proof of murder. That distinction matters. The women were missing. Their fate was unknown. Investigators could consider abduction and foul play. But without bodies or definitive forensic evidence, they could not simply state what happened as fact. That is why the Springfield 3 case remains a mystery. There is a difference between what investigators suspect and what they can prove. That difference has remained for decades. The years that followed would produce rumors, possible sightings, suspects, theories, searches, and countless discussions about what might have happened. But most importantly, they produced questions. Why were 3 women taken? Why were there so few obvious clues? Did someone they knew have something to do with it? Was the disappearance planned? Was it spontaneous? Was there one offender? Were there several? And where were the women taken? Every theory had to confront the same problem. There was no final piece of evidence. Today, the FBI still lists all 3 women as missing. The official alert states that they have not been seen or heard from since June 7, 1992. That sentence is simple, but behind it are more than 30 years of unanswered questions. More than 30 years of families waiting. More than 30 years of investigators trying to reconstruct a few hours. And somewhere inside those hours is the answer. The morning began normally, but by the time the sun was fully up, 3 women were gone, and nobody could explain why. The first search would soon expand beyond the house. Investigators would begin looking at the people surrounding Suzanne and Stacy. They would examine the people who knew Cheryl. They would revisit the graduation celebrations. And eventually, attention would turn toward individuals whose names would become permanently connected to the case. Some of those names would be considered suspects. Others would simply become part of the investigation. But before any suspect could be examined, investigators needed to understand one thing. Who were the 3 women before they disappeared? Because sometimes the key to understanding a disappearance is found not in the final hours, but in the lives that came before them. Chapter 3: The Three Women Before They Vanished. Before the Springfield Three became a mystery, they were simply three people living ordinary lives. That is something that can easily be forgotten when a case becomes famous. Years later, people remember the photographs. They remember the missing person posters. They remember the unanswered questions. But before June 7, 1992, Cheryl Levitt, Suzanne Streeter, and Stacy McCall were not names in a case file. They were a mother, a daughter, and a friend. They had families. They had routines. They had plans. And they were looking toward the future. Cheryl Levitt was 47 years old. She was the mother of Suzanne. Her home on East Del Mar Street in Springfield would eventually become one of the most important locations in the investigation. But before that morning, it was simply home. A place where Cheryl lived her everyday life. A place where her daughter could return after going out with friends. A place where people expected to wake up the next morning and continue their routines. There was nothing about the house that suggested it would eventually become associated with one of Missouri's most enduring missing person cases. That is one of the unsettling things about crimes like this. The places where terrible events happen often look completely ordinary beforehand. A house is just a house. A street is just a street. Until something happens there. And then the location becomes part of history. Suzanne Streeter was 19. In June 1992, she was at an important moment in her life. She had just graduated from high school. The future was beginning. For many young people, graduation is a moment filled with uncertainty. There may be plans for college, plans for work, plans to move away, plans to stay close to home, or simply plans to enjoy the summer before deciding what comes next. Suzanne was celebrating that milestone with her friends. The evening of June 6th was supposed to be one of those nights she would remember. Instead, it became the final confirmed night of her life. According to the FBI, Suzanne and Stacy attended graduation parties and later returned to Cheryl's home. FBI.gov. After that, the timeline becomes uncertain. Stacy McCall was 18. Like Suzanne, she had just graduated. She was Suzanne's friend, and the two had spent the evening celebrating together. Their decision to return to Suzanne's home was not unusual. It was the kind of decision young friends make after a long night. Go home. Get some sleep. Talk about the evening. Think about what comes next. Nothing about that decision suggested danger. And yet, by morning, Stacy was missing. So was Suzanne. And so was Cheryl. Three people who had gone to sleep, or were expected to be at home, were suddenly gone. To understand the mystery, investigators had to understand the people around them. Who were Suzanne's closest friends? Who was Stacy dating? Who had they spoken with that evening? Who had been at the graduation parties? Who knew where they planned to spend the night? And who knew that they were at Cheryl's house? These questions were important because information about a person's location can be valuable. If someone knew the women were at the house, they would have known where to find them. But knowing their location does not automatically make someone a suspect. A person could know where they were for completely innocent reasons. Investigators had to separate ordinary friendships from genuine evidence. That distinction would become increasingly important as the case attracted attention. The final night also created a timeline. Suzanne and Stacy were seen during the graduation celebrations. Later, they returned to the Levitt home. At approximately 2:15 a.m., the disappearance window began. By approximately 7:30 a.m., the three were gone. 5 hours. That was all. 5 hours in which something happened that would remain unexplained for decades. The difficulty was that nighttime creates gaps. Most people are asleep. Businesses are closed. Traffic is lighter. And witnesses are fewer. If someone wanted to move three people without attracting attention, the early morning hours could provide an opportunity. But again, that is a possibility, not proof of what happened. The actual events remain unknown. Investigators also had to consider Suzanne and Stacy's social circles. Graduation had brought many people together. Friends who had not seen each other for months. Classmates, parents, neighbors, young people moving between parties, cars traveling across Springfield. The number of potential witnesses was large. But the important question was not simply, who saw them? It was, who saw them last? A last confirmed sighting can become one of the most valuable pieces of evidence in a disappearance. It establishes where someone was. It establishes when they were there. And it creates a starting point. From there, investigators can build a timeline. In the Springfield 3 case, the last known location became the Levitt home. And from that point, the timeline suddenly disappears. That missing timeline became the heart of the investigation. Imagine having a map with 2 points. Point A, the women are at the house. Point B, they are gone. Everything between those points is missing. Investigators have spent decades trying to fill that space. They have examined witnesses. They have examined theories. They have searched locations. They have investigated possible suspects. But the gap remains, and every unanswered minute creates another possibility. One question investigators had to consider was whether the women had voluntarily left. It was possible in the early stages of any missing person investigation. People sometimes leave unexpectedly. They may want distance from their families. They may have personal problems. They may simply decide to go somewhere. But the circumstances surrounding the Springfield 3 disappearance made a simple voluntary departure difficult to explain. The women left behind their normal lives. They did not establish contact afterward. They did not return. And 3 people disappeared together from the same home. The combination was unusual. That is why investigators increasingly considered the possibility of foul play. But even then, the central question remained. Who? There was another question. Why? A motive can sometimes reveal a suspect. If someone had a serious conflict with a victim, investigators can examine that relationship. If someone had threatened a victim, that information becomes important. If someone had financial or personal motives, investigators examine those possibilities. But with 3 victims, motive becomes more complicated. Why Cheryl? Why Suzanne? Why Stacy? Were they all targeted? Or was one person the intended target, and the others became involved simply because they were there? That question has never been conclusively answered, and it is one of the reasons the case has remained so difficult. If Suzanne had been the target, why take Cheryl and Stacy? If Cheryl had been the target, why take 2 young women who happened to be there? If Stacy had been the target, why would the other 2 disappear too? Or perhaps none of them was individually targeted. Perhaps the circumstances of that night created a situation that investigators still do not understand. These possibilities have been discussed for years, but without definitive evidence, they remain theories. The facts are simpler. 3 women were at the house. They disappeared, and they have never been found. There is another emotional dimension to the case. Suzanne and Stacy were young. Their lives were just beginning. They had completed high school. They had friends. They had families. They had plans. Their disappearance did not simply remove 3 people from one morning. It removed everything that would have happened afterward. The birthdays, the careers, the relationships, the ordinary mistakes and successes, the conversations that families normally have over decades. All of those future moments disappeared with them. That is why the case has remained so painful for the people who knew them. The mystery is not abstract. It is personal. And then there was Cheryl. Her disappearance meant that Suzanne's family lost more than one person. It also meant that whatever happened that morning affected an entire family network. People who expected to hear from Cheryl. People who expected to see Suzanne. People who expected Stacy to come home. Instead, they received uncertainty. And uncertainty can last longer than grief. When a loved one dies, there is an answer. There is a funeral. There is a place to visit. There are memories to hold on to. But when someone disappears, the family is left asking whether they are alive, whether they are suffering, whether they will return, whether someone knows where they are. The Springfield 3 case created exactly that kind of uncertainty. As investigators continued working, the public became increasingly interested. The 3 photographs became familiar. The story spread beyond Springfield. People began suggesting theories. Some believed the women were abducted. Others believed someone they knew was responsible. Some theories involved specific suspects. Others involved locations where the women might have been taken. But the investigation had to separate those theories from facts. That is especially important in a case this old. A rumor repeated for 30 years can begin to sound like a fact. But repetition does not make something true. Investigators need evidence, and that is what they continued searching for. The FBI still asks anyone with information about the disappearance to come forward. That means the possibility of a witness remains important. Someone may remember something from that night. A vehicle, a conversation, a person, a location, a strange event. Something that seemed insignificant in 1992 could look very different today. Perhaps someone was afraid to speak then. Perhaps they did not realize what they had seen. Perhaps they were protecting someone. Or perhaps they simply forgot until something reminded them. That is why cold cases continue to generate new appeals. Because memory can sometimes produce information that was not available during the original investigation. But there was one thing investigators could not change: the passage of time. More than 30 years have now passed since the women disappeared. People who were young adults in 1992 are now older. Some witnesses may no longer be alive. Some locations have changed. Some businesses have disappeared. Some records may no longer exist. And yet the case continues. Because the absence of an answer does not mean there is no answer. It simply means investigators have not found it. The Springfield 3 therefore entered history, not because of one dramatic piece of evidence, but because of what was missing. 3 people. No confirmed destination. No confirmed contact afterward. No confirmed explanation. And no final answer. The mystery grew larger with every passing year. But the investigation could not remain focused only on the women. It had to look outward, toward the people they knew, toward the people they had seen that night, and toward anyone who might have had a reason to approach the house. Because if someone came to the Levitt home that morning, someone may have known the women well enough to get close. And that possibility would become one of the most important questions in the investigation. Was the person who came to the house a stranger, or someone the 3 women already knew? Asterisk, asterisk. That question would follow the case for years. And the answer could change everything. Bilkul thumbs up Samaj Gaya. Agse ek chapter complete Karunga. For surf next chapter Kulia Pachunga. Bilkul Peli whale format Kitara. Ubbi surf chapter 4 Dina High. Chapter 4. The house on East Delmar Street. The house on East Delmar Street looked ordinary. There was nothing about it that suggested it would become the center of one of Missouri's most mysterious disappearances. On the night of June 6, 1992, it was simply the home of Cheryl Levitt. Her daughter, Suzanne Streeter, had returned there after celebrating her high school graduation. Suzanne's friend, Stacy McCall, was with her. 3 women, 1 house, and a quiet summer night. Nobody knew that before morning, all 3 would disappear. The first thing investigators had to understand was the house itself. Who normally lived there? Who had keys? Who visited? Who knew the layout? Who knew the women were inside? Those questions became important because the disappearance did not appear to begin somewhere far away. It began at the place where the women were last known to be. The FBI identifies Cheryl's home as the last known location of all 3 women. That made the house the starting point of the entire investigation. Investigators had to reconstruct everything they could about what happened there. The rooms, the belongings, the condition of the property, the telephone, the porch, the vehicles. Every detail had to be considered, because when there are no bodies and no confirmed sightings afterward, the last known location becomes incredibly important. There was no obvious explanation waiting inside the house. The women were gone, but their lives had not been packed away. Their belongings remained. Their vehicles remained. There was no clear indication that they had prepared to leave. That created an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps they had not intended to leave at all. Perhaps someone had made the decision for them. But who? And how? 3 people disappearing from one home should have produced some kind of evidence. A struggle, a witness, a vehicle, a noise, something. Yet the case seemed to contain very little that could immediately identify the person responsible. That absence became one of the defining mysteries of the Springfield 3. Then investigators encountered another strange detail. The porch light. A globe was broken. On its own, that might mean almost nothing. Light fixtures break. People bump into things. Accidents happen. But when 3 people disappear from a home during the same night, every unusual detail deserves attention. Investigators had to ask whether the broken globe was connected. Had there been a struggle outside? Had someone struck the light? Had someone fallen against it? Or had it been broken earlier? There was no definitive answer, and that uncertainty remained. The broken light became another piece of the puzzle, but not the missing piece. Then there was the answering machine. In the early 1990s, an answering machine could be extremely important. There were no smartphones, no text message histories, no cloud backups, no automatic location records. A message left on a home answering machine could preserve a moment in time. A voice, a name, a request, a warning, a clue. But in this case, an answering machine message was reportedly erased. That created another mystery. What had the message contained? Who left it? And why was it erased? The significance of that message has never been fully established. But its disappearance meant that investigators potentially lost information that could have helped reconstruct the final hours. The vehicles presented another important clue. If the women had left voluntarily, investigators would expect some explanation for how they traveled. But the vehicles remaining at the home complicated that theory. Why would 3 people disappear without taking the transportation normally available to them? Why would they leave personal belongings behind? Why would they make no known contact afterward? The more investigators examined the circumstances, the more difficult a simple voluntary disappearance became to explain. That did not prove an abduction, but it made the possibility difficult to ignore. There was another question. Could 3 people really have been taken from the house without attracting attention? The answer depended on circumstances investigators could not fully reconstruct. Perhaps it happened quietly. Perhaps the women knew whoever came to the house. Perhaps they were asleep. Perhaps they were threatened. Perhaps more than one person was involved. Or perhaps the actual sequence of events was completely different. The evidence did not provide a definitive public answer. And without that answer, investigators had to keep several possibilities open. The timing was especially important. The FBI gives an approximate disappearance window from 2:15 a.m. until 7:30 a.m. on June 7th. That means investigators were dealing with the darkest and quietest part of the night. Most people were asleep. Traffic was lighter, and fewer witnesses were outside. If someone wanted to approach the house without attracting attention, the early morning hours could have provided an opportunity. But again, opportunity is not evidence of guilt. It simply helps investigators understand the circumstances. Imagine the neighborhood at that time. Most houses were dark. Most people were sleeping. The streets were quiet. And somewhere in that quiet neighborhood, something happened inside or around the Levitt home. 3 women disappeared. Nobody immediately knew. Nobody could explain it. And the person responsible, if another person was involved, had enough time to leave. That possibility would become increasingly important. Because the longer the gap between the disappearance and the discovery, the greater the chance that whoever was responsible had already escaped. But investigators also had to think about another possibility. What if the person responsible knew the women? That would potentially explain why there was so little obvious resistance. Someone familiar could approach the house without immediately creating suspicion. Someone the women trusted could enter without forcing a door. Someone who knew them could know where they were. But investigators could not simply assume this. They needed to identify people who had legitimate connections to the women. And that meant examining their friendships and relationships. Suzanne's friends, Stacy's friends, Cheryl's acquaintances, people from the graduation celebrations, neighbors, former acquaintances, anyone who might have known that Suzanne and Stacy planned to spend the night at Cheryl's house. The circle was large, but somewhere inside that circle might be information. The investigation therefore moved beyond the physical house. Investigators began reconstructing the night. Who had seen Suzanne? Who had seen Stacy? When did they leave the celebrations? Who saw them afterward? When did they arrive home? Who knew where they were going? These questions could potentially establish the final hours. And the final hours were everything. Because the disappearance happened somewhere between one moment and another. If investigators could find the exact moment, they could begin asking the next question. Who was nearby? The graduation celebrations became especially important. Suzanne and Stacy had been around other people. That meant investigators had witnesses who could potentially establish parts of the evening. Some people could confirm where the women had been. Others could confirm when they left. But the further investigators moved into the early morning hours, the fewer confirmed details existed. Eventually, the trail reached the house, and then it disappeared. That gap would become one of the most frustrating parts of the investigation. There was also the question of motive. If the women were abducted, why? Why take 3 people? Was one person the target? Were all 3 targeted? Was the disappearance connected to something in their personal lives? Or was it a random act? Without a confirmed suspect, investigators could not answer those questions. And without a motive, it was harder to narrow the field. This is why the Springfield 3 case became so difficult. There were too many possibilities, and not enough evidence to eliminate them. Years later, many theories would emerge. Some would focus on people known to the women. Some would focus on strangers. Some would suggest that the women were taken somewhere nearby. Others would suggest they were transported much farther away. Searches would take place. Tips would come in. Names would be examined. But the central fact would remain unchanged. No confirmed location. No confirmed sighting. No confirmed explanation. 3 women had vanished. The house on East Del Mar Street, therefore, became more than a home. It became the last known location of 3 missing people. For the families, it represented the place where their loved ones were last known to be alive. For investigators, it represented the beginning of the mystery. And for the public, it became a symbol of a question that has never been answered. What happened there? What happened during those early morning hours? And who, if anyone, entered that house? The answers remained hidden. But the investigation was only beginning. Because once investigators understood the house, they needed to understand the people who surrounded it. And one of the most important places to look was the night of the graduation celebrations. Before the women disappeared, they had been seen, and those final confirmed hours could contain the first real clues. June 6, 1992, was supposed to be a night of celebration. Suzanne Streeter and Stacy McCall had just graduated from high school. For them, graduation was not an ending. It was the beginning of whatever came next. That evening, the 2 young women attended graduation parties around Springfield, Missouri. Friends were celebrating. Students were saying goodbye to one another. Families were watching their children reach an important milestone. And for Suzanne and Stacy, the night was filled with the excitement that usually comes with graduation. Nobody attending those celebrations knew that the 2 young women would soon become the center of a mystery that would last for decades. Suzanne was 19. Stacy was 18. They were close friends, and after spending the evening celebrating, they eventually made their way back to Suzanne's home. That decision seemed completely ordinary. The plan was essentially to spend the night at the Levitt residence. Cheryl Levitt, Suzanne's mother, was there. The 3 women were therefore together under one roof. It was the last confirmed setting in which all 3 were known to be together. According to the FBI, Suzanne and Stacy returned to Cheryl's home after the graduation celebrations. Their disappearance occurred sometime between approximately 2:15 a.m. and 7:30 a.m. on June 7th. That narrow window would eventually become the most important timeline in the entire case. Think about how ordinary those first few hours may have seemed. The celebrations were over. The guests had gone home. The neighborhood was becoming quiet. The 3 women were at the house. Perhaps they talked about the evening. Perhaps they discussed graduation. Perhaps they talked about what they wanted to do next. Maybe they were tired. Maybe they were preparing to sleep. Those ordinary moments are impossible to reconstruct today. Nobody knows exactly what the last conversation between the 3 women was. Nobody knows when they went to sleep. Nobody knows whether they were awake when something happened. And nobody knows exactly when the last normal moment ended. This uncertainty is one of the reasons the case has remained so difficult. There is no publicly established minute-by-minute timeline. There is no confirmed account describing exactly what happened inside the house. There is only a beginning and an ending. At some point, the women were there. Later, they were gone. Everything between those moments remains uncertain. Investigators naturally began looking backward. The graduation parties became important. Who had seen Suzanne and Stacy? Who had spoken with them? Who had been with them? Who knew where they were going afterward? These questions were not necessarily about suspects. They were about establishing facts. Every confirmed sighting could help investigators build a timeline. If someone saw Suzanne at a certain time, that became one point. If someone saw Stacy later, that became another. Eventually, investigators could compare those points with the estimated disappearance window. The goal was simple: find the last moment when the women were definitely alive and safe. But there was an important complication. Graduation night involved many people. There were multiple celebrations. Friends moved from one place to another. Cars traveled through the city. People came and went. And as the night became later, memories became harder to organize. A person might remember seeing Suzanne. Another might remember Stacy. Someone else might remember them leaving. But the exact times could become uncertain. That is a problem in any investigation. Human memory is not a perfect recording. People remember events differently. A few minutes can become an hour. An ordinary detail can disappear completely, and something that seemed meaningless at the time may become important years later. Still, investigators continued reconstructing the evening. The women eventually returned to the Levitt residence, and then the trail became extremely thin. That was the moment investigators needed to understand, because the graduation celebrations gave them witnesses. The house gave them a location, but between those 2 points was a gap. A dangerous gap. The question became, did anyone follow them home? There is no publicly established answer, but investigators had to consider the possibility. If someone wanted to abduct the women, knowing their destination would have been important, and anyone who had been around them during the evening could potentially have learned where they planned to spend the night. Again, that does not make every person at the celebration suspicious. It simply shows why investigators had to examine the evening carefully. Another possibility was that someone already knew. Someone who knew Suzanne. Someone who knew Stacy. Someone who knew Cheryl. Someone who knew the house. If such a person arrived during the early morning hours, the women might not have immediately considered the visitor a threat. That possibility has remained part of the discussion surrounding the case. But it remains only a possibility. No publicly established evidence has conclusively identified who entered the home, or even confirmed that a particular person entered it. The last known location remained the house. That fact matters, because the case is not simply a disappearance from a road or a public place. It is a disappearance connected to a private residence. 3 people disappeared from the same location. That makes the circumstances especially unusual. And it raises another question. Why were all 3 together? If one person was targeted, why did the other 2 disappear? If the 3 were intentionally taken, what connected them? If it was a random event, how did the offender encounter all 3 at once? Every possibility creates another question. And then there was the absence of communication. After the disappearance, there was no confirmed contact from the women. No reliable call. No confirmed message. No verified sighting. The FBI states that the 3 have not been seen or heard from since June 7, 1992. For their families, that silence must have been devastating. At first, there may have been hope. Maybe they would call. Maybe they had gone somewhere unexpectedly. Maybe they would return. But as the hours became days, and days became weeks, the silence became harder to explain. The case would eventually become a cold case. But at the beginning, it was anything but cold. It was an active emergency. Families wanted answers. Friends wanted answers. Investigators were searching. The community was talking. Every possible lead mattered. Every possible sighting had to be examined. And somewhere in Springfield, someone may have known what happened. The challenge was finding that person. One of the most haunting possibilities is that someone may have seen something that night and never realized its importance. A car parked near the house. A person walking outside. A vehicle leaving unusually early. A light. A sound. A conversation. Something that appeared completely normal at the time. That is why investigators often return to old witnesses. Memory changes, but sometimes a forgotten detail can suddenly return. A person hears about the case years later. They see an old photograph. They remember a conversation. They realize that something they witnessed was not ordinary, and they contact investigators. In a case like this, even a small detail can matter. But the years continued. The investigation did not produce the definitive answer the families wanted. The women remained missing. Their photographs continued to circulate. Their names remained in missing person databases. And the question remained, where did the Springfield 3 go? Today, The official FBI case information continues to list Cheryl Levitt, Suzanne Streeter, and Stacy McCall as missing. That means the story is still unfinished. There has been no final courtroom explanation, no confirmed account of the women's fate, no person officially convicted for their disappearance, and no definitive answer to what happened during those early morning hours. Only an empty space in the timeline, a space that begins sometime after the women returned home, and ends when someone discovered that they were gone. The last night, therefore, remains one of the most important parts of the case, because before there were theories, before there were suspects, before there were searches, there was simply a graduation night, 3 women, a house, and a few quiet hours. Then everything changed, and as investigators began examining the people who had been around Suzanne and Stacy that evening, one thing became clear. The answer might not be somewhere far away. It might begin with someone who was already part of their world. Chapter 6, The People Around Them. As investigators began reconstructing the final night, their attention naturally turned toward the people who had been around Suzanne and Stacy. This did not mean that everyone who knew them was a suspect. Far from it. In a missing person investigation, investigators have to understand a person's world before they can understand what may have happened to them. Friends, classmates, neighbors, family members, people they had met during graduation celebrations, and people who knew where they planned to spend the night. Every relationship could provide another piece of the timeline, and in the Springfield 3 case, the timeline was everything. Suzanne had just graduated. Stacy had just graduated. Their social circle was therefore large. Graduation brings people together. Friends who have known each other for years. People who may have lost touch. Families, classmates, and acquaintances. The evening was filled with movement. People went from one celebration to another. Some stayed late. Others went home. Cars traveled through Springfield. And eventually, Suzanne and Stacy returned to the Levitt residence. That was the last confirmed destination. After that, investigators had to ask a difficult question. Who knew they were there? Someone who knew the women might have known their plans. Perhaps they had mentioned where they were going. Perhaps a friend knew they were staying at Suzanne's house. Perhaps someone had heard them discuss it during the evening. That information alone would not be suspicious. Friends naturally talk about their plans. But after the disappearance, those ordinary conversations became important. Investigators had to reconstruct them. Who knew? When did they know? And could anyone have used that information to find the women? The investigation also had to consider the possibility of an acquaintance. If the person responsible was known to the women, investigators needed to examine their relationships. Was there anyone with a reason to harm Cheryl? Was there anyone who had a conflict with Suzanne? Was there anyone who had a problem with Stacy? Was there anyone who had behaved strangely before the disappearance? These questions can be uncomfortable, because sometimes the person investigators need to examine is not a stranger. It may be someone who once appeared completely ordinary, but suspicion is not proof. A person can have a difficult relationship with someone and still have nothing to do with a disappearance. Investigators needed evidence. That is why the case could not simply be solved by looking at who disliked the victims. They had to look at opportunity. Who could reach the house? Who knew the location? Who was awake during the early morning hours? Who had access to transportation? Who could potentially leave the area without attracting attention? And who could explain their whereabouts? Those questions would eventually be asked about many people. But one question remained especially important. Who could have known exactly where the 3 women were that night? The house itself provided another reason to examine acquaintances. There was no confirmed public evidence of a dramatic forced entry. That meant investigators could not simply assume that an unknown stranger had broken into the home. Perhaps the person was allowed inside. Perhaps the women recognized them. Perhaps the events unfolded so quickly that nobody had time to react. Or perhaps investigators were missing something. Again, there was no definitive public reconstruction. The uncertainty remained. The broken porch-light globe became part of that uncertainty. If someone had approached the house, was the light damaged during that approach? Could someone have tried to disable it? Or was the broken globe completely unrelated? Investigators could not simply assign meaning to it. They had to consider all possibilities. The same was true of the answering machine. A message had reportedly been erased. Could it have been important? Possibly. Could it have been completely ordinary? Also possible. Without the recording, there was no way to know. This was the problem investigators faced again and again. Almost every clue had two possible meanings. A strange detail could be connected, or it could be coincidence. A person could look suspicious, or they could simply have had an unfortunate connection to the case. A vehicle could have been important, or it could have been completely unrelated. Cold case investigations require patience because investigators have to resist the temptation to turn uncertainty into certainty. As the case continued, different theories began to emerge. Some focused on people close to the women. Others suggested a stranger. Some theories involved an abduction. Others questioned whether the women might have left voluntarily. But the circumstances inside the house continued to make the simplest explanations difficult. 3 people disappeared. Their belongings remained. Their vehicles remained. They did not contact their families, and they were never reliably seen again. The FBI continues to classify the 3 as missing. There was also something else investigators had to consider. Could the 3 women have been taken because of one specific person? Perhaps the offender wanted one of them. Maybe the other 2 became involved simply because they were present. This possibility is common in multi-victim crimes. One person may be targeted, others may become witnesses. But if that happened here, investigators still had to determine who the intended target was. Was it Cheryl? Suzanne? Stacy? There is no definitive public answer. And without knowing the intended target, the motive becomes even harder to understand. For the families, these questions were not theoretical. Every theory represented another possibility about what had happened to someone they loved. And every failed lead meant another period of waiting. The longer the women remained missing, the more difficult the situation became. Evidence disappears. Memories fade. People move. Relationships change. And witnesses who once knew important details may eventually forget them. That is why time is both the enemy and the strange ally of a cold case investigation. Time can destroy evidence, but time can also change people. Someone who refused to speak in 1992 might feel differently decades later. Someone who was afraid may no longer be afraid. Someone who protected another person may eventually decide that the truth matters more. The investigation therefore continued beyond the first days. Names were examined. Tips were received. Searches were conducted. The public continued discussing the case, but no definitive answer emerged. The 3 women remained missing, and the people who loved them remained without closure. Then came another important realization. The person responsible, if there was an abduction, had somehow managed to remove 3 people from one location. That meant there may have been transportation, a vehicle, a route, a destination, and perhaps a place where evidence could have been left behind. Investigators therefore had to look beyond Springfield. If the women were transported away from the house, where could they have gone? How far could someone travel during the early morning hours? What roads could they have used? Where could a vehicle have stopped? And most importantly, did anyone see them after they left? That question would lead the investigation in many directions. Over the years, possible locations would attract attention. Searches would be conducted. Tips would lead investigators into areas where someone believed the women might have been taken. But searches require something more than suspicion. They need evidence. And without a confirmed location, investigators were often searching for 3 people in an enormous world. That is an almost impossible task. Yet the case never completely disappeared. The photographs remained. The names remained. And the FBI continued to maintain a public missing person alert. The official alert provides physical descriptions and identifying information for all 3 women and asks anyone with information to contact investigators. That means the door remains open. Someone could still come forward. A new piece of evidence could still appear. A new forensic technique could still produce information. And an old lead could still become important. But before investigators could solve the case, they had to understand the people closest to the women. And one name would eventually receive particular attention. Not because attention automatically meant guilt, but because investigators believed that person had a connection worth examining. A person whose name would become closely associated with the disappearance. A person whose story would be questioned. and a person whose possible connection to the women would become one of the most discussed aspects of the case. But before we reach that part of the investigation, we need to go back to the beginning, to the first moment when the families realized that something was seriously wrong. The morning of June 7, 1992, slowly turned into something nobody had expected. 3 women were missing. At first, the situation may not have felt like the beginning of a decades-long mystery. People disappear for many reasons. Sometimes they leave voluntarily. Sometimes plans change. Sometimes a person simply cannot be reached. But this situation was different. There were 3 people. They had been together. They had been at the same house. And then all 3 were gone. The FBI identifies the Levitt residence as their last known location and places the disappearance between approximately 2:15 a.m. and 7:30 a.m. That was enough to turn concern into an investigation. The first priority was finding the women. Investigators needed to know where they could have gone. Friends and relatives were contacted. The previous night's events were reconstructed. The graduation celebrations were examined, and the house was carefully considered. Every detail mattered, because at this stage, nobody knew whether they were dealing with a voluntary disappearance, an accident, an abduction, or something much worse. There was no luxury of knowing the ending. Investigators had to work forward from almost nothing. Searches began. People looked for signs of the women. They looked around the neighborhood. They considered places the women might have gone. They checked information that could establish their movements. And as the search continued, one fact became harder and harder to ignore. There was no obvious reason for all 3 women to disappear. Suzanne had just graduated. Stacy had just graduated. Cheryl was at home. Nothing about the evening suggested that the 3 had planned to vanish. Their disappearance was therefore becoming increasingly suspicious. The families were facing a terrible kind of uncertainty. When someone disappears, the mind tries to create explanations. Maybe they are somewhere safe. Maybe they will call. Maybe they left unexpectedly. Maybe there has been a misunderstanding. But as time passes without contact, those possibilities become harder to maintain. And when 3 people disappear from one location, the fear becomes much greater. The families needed to know whether their loved ones were alive. And if they were not, they needed to know what had happened. Investigators also needed to determine whether the 3 women had been seen after leaving the house. That meant searching for witnesses. A person might have seen a vehicle. Someone might have heard something. A neighbor might have noticed unusual activity. Someone driving through the area might have remembered a car. At the time, none of these details would necessarily have seemed important. But after a disappearance, an ordinary observation can become evidence. That is why investigators ask people to remember even the smallest details. The problem was that June 7, 1992, was not a crime scene that announced itself. There was no obvious public disturbance. There was no confirmed eyewitness who could say, "I saw the women being taken." There was no confirmed photograph of them after they left the house. And there was no confirmed message from them. Instead, investigators had silence. 3 missing people, and a house that seemed to hold very few answers. The case quickly became known in Springfield. People began talking. Friends began asking questions. The community became aware that something unusual had happened. And as the days passed, the women's photographs became increasingly important. Their faces were circulated so that people could recognize them. Their descriptions were shared. The hope was simple. Someone somewhere had seen them. Someone might remember something. Someone might know where they went. The FBI continues to list the 3 women as missing and requests information from anyone who may know what happened. But there was another reason the case was difficult. The women did not disappear from a remote location. They disappeared from a normal neighborhood. That meant someone responsible would have had to move through an environment where other people lived. Even in the early morning, there was always a possibility of witnesses. A passing driver, a neighbor waking up, someone leaving for work early, someone walking a dog, someone hearing a vehicle. The question was whether anyone noticed something unusual. And if they did, whether they realized its importance. Investigators began looking at the timeline more carefully. The graduation celebrations, the return home, the early morning hours, the disappearance. Each point had to be examined. If Suzanne and Stacy were seen at a particular time, investigators could establish that they were still alive then. If someone knew when they arrived at the house, that could narrow the timeline. If a neighbor remembered hearing something at a particular hour, that could potentially become important. The goal was to reduce the unknown period. But even with all of that work, the central gap remained. Somewhere between approximately 2:15 a.m. and 7:30 a.m., the three women disappeared. Then investigators had to confront an even darker possibility. If the women had been abducted, they were probably not still in the house. Someone would have had to move them. That meant transportation. And transportation meant a route. Perhaps a road leading out of Springfield. Perhaps a nearby location. Perhaps somewhere much farther away. But without knowing the vehicle or destination, the possibilities were almost endless. And that is where a missing person investigation can become overwhelming. A city is large. A state is larger. And the country is enormous. Three people can disappear into that space very quickly. Yet investigators did not stop. They followed leads. They questioned people. They examined information. They searched. And they continued asking the public for help. Because sometimes the answer to a cold case is not hidden in a complicated forensic discovery. Sometimes it is hidden in someone's memory. Someone who saw something. Someone who heard something. Someone who knew something. And perhaps, even in 1992, someone already knew more than they admitted. The investigation would eventually generate many theories. Some would involve people who knew the women. Others would involve strangers. Some would suggest that the women were taken together. Others would suggest that something happened to one of them first. But at this stage, investigators still had a much more basic problem. They needed to find the women, alive or dead. They needed a location. They needed evidence. They needed something that could tell them what direction the investigation should take. Without that, every theory remained possible. The families continued waiting. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. And the initial urgency slowly transformed into something else. A long-term search. The kind of search where hope and fear exist together. The kind where every telephone call can produce a moment of panic. Every new lead can bring hope. And every failed search can bring disappointment. For the families, the mystery was not an interesting story. It was their life. Three people they loved were missing. And nobody could tell them why. Years later, the case would become one of the most recognizable unsolved disappearances in the United States. But the investigation did not begin that way. It began with a simple realization. Three women were missing, and someone had to find out where they had gone. That search would continue for decades, and as investigators examined the case, they would encounter names that repeatedly appeared in discussions surrounding the disappearance. Some would become suspects. Some would be ruled out. Some would remain subjects of speculation, and one particular name would eventually become especially controversial. But before investigators could determine what role, if any, that person played, they had to examine the evidence surrounding the house itself. Because sometimes, the smallest physical detail can tell investigators more than a person's story. By the time investigators began examining the Levitt home more closely, one fact had already become painfully clear. The house was not simply the place where three people had last been seen. It was potentially the last place where the truth had existed in physical form. Every object inside it had been there before the disappearance. Every room had a history. Every doorway represented a possible route. Every telephone call could potentially establish a moment in time. And every small detail had to be considered carefully. The problem was that the house did not provide investigators with the kind of obvious answer they needed. There was no single piece of evidence that immediately revealed who had taken the women or where they had gone. Instead, investigators were left trying to understand a collection of ordinary details surrounding an extraordinary disappearance. The official FBI VCAP alert confirms that Cheryl Levitt, Suzanne Streeter, and Stacy McCall disappeared from Levitt's home between approximately 2:15 a.m. and 7:30 a.m. on June 7, 1992. That meant the house was central to everything, but central did not mean conclusive. One of the most important facts was that the women's belongings remained behind. That detail makes the disappearance difficult to explain as a simple decision to leave. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that three people are gone. Then you look around. Their things are still there. Their normal lives appear frozen in place. There is no suitcase packed for a trip, no obvious preparation for a long journey, no clear explanation. The absence of preparation creates questions. If they planned to leave, where were they going? Why did they leave so much behind? If they did not plan to leave, then what caused them to disappear? Those questions became increasingly important. The vehicles also mattered. If 3 people planned to leave the area voluntarily, transportation would normally be part of that plan. But the circumstances surrounding the vehicles did not provide investigators with a simple explanation. Instead of finding an obvious trail leading away from the home, investigators were left with a disappearance that seemed to begin and end around the same location. That was disturbing, because a person can disappear from a public place and simply walk away. But 3 people disappearing from a home creates a different set of possibilities. Someone may have come to them, someone may have taken them, or something happened inside the house that investigators could not reconstruct. And then there was the question of entry. How did whoever may have been responsible get inside? That question has fascinated people for years, but it is important to separate what is established from what is speculation. The public record does not provide a definitive reconstruction of how the women disappeared from the house. There is no confirmed public account proving exactly how an offender entered, whether the women willingly opened the door, or whether a forced entry occurred. That uncertainty is precisely why the case remains unsolved. Investigators had to work with what they could establish, not what they wished they could establish. The porch became another part of the mystery. A broken globe on the porch light was reported as one of the unusual details associated with the home. At first glance, it sounds significant. A broken light near the scene of a disappearance naturally makes people wonder whether there had been a struggle. Could someone have struck it? Could someone have damaged it while approaching or leaving? Could it have been broken during some kind of confrontation? Or was it simply an unrelated accident? Without definitive evidence connecting it to the disappearance, investigators could not treat it as an answer. It remained a detail, a strange detail, but still only a detail, and that distinction matters. Cold cases are filled with details like this. Something looks unusual. People build a theory around it. The theory gets repeated. Eventually, the theory begins to sound like fact. But investigators have to keep asking, what can actually be proven? A broken light can prove that a light was broken. It cannot automatically prove who broke it. It cannot prove why. And it cannot prove that the damage occurred during the disappearance. That is why evidence has to be handled carefully, especially in a case where so many years have passed. Then there was the telephone. In 1992, communication worked very differently. There were no smartphones, no location history, no text message databases, no social media timestamps, no security cameras covering every street. A home telephone and an answering machine could therefore be valuable sources of information. A call could establish that someone was awake. A message could reveal who had contacted the house. A timestamp could help reconstruct part of the night, and a voice could potentially identify a person. But in the Springfield 3 case, an answering machine message was reportedly erased. That meant a potential piece of information was no longer available. Whatever the message contained, investigators could not simply replay it years later. Think about how frustrating that must have been. A missing message can create questions that cannot be answered. Who called? What did they say? Was the call connected to the women? Was it completely ordinary? Was the message erased intentionally? Was it erased accidentally? There is no definitive public answer that resolves all of those questions. And without the original recording, the possibilities remain. This is one of the reasons older cases can be so difficult. Evidence that might have been preserved today could have been lost in the early 1990s. Technology was different. Storage was different. Investigative practices were different. And sometimes information simply disappeared. The house itself, therefore, became a kind of silent witness. It could not tell investigators what happened, but it contained traces of the lives that had been there. The rooms, the furniture, the belongings, the telephone, the vehicles outside, the porch. Everything represented another piece of the timeline. Investigators had to ask what was normal and what was unusual. That distinction can be difficult when dealing with a home. Homes are full of ordinary disorder. Objects are moved. Doors are opened. Lights are turned on and off. Things are left where people last used them. A detective has to determine whether something is actually evidence or simply part of everyday life. There was also the question of whether the women had been asleep. If they were asleep when someone arrived, that could explain why there might not have been an obvious confrontation. If they were awake, investigators would have to consider whether they knew the person. If they were threatened, there might have been little opportunity to resist. If they willingly opened the door, the person may have been familiar. But these are possibilities. The exact sequence has never been publicly established. That uncertainty is important to maintain, because when a case has been discussed for decades, speculation can easily become confused with fact. Another challenge was the lack of a confirmed destination. Suppose someone had taken the women. Where would they have gone? That question is enormous. Springfield is connected to roads leading in many directions. A vehicle could travel for hours. A person could leave the city before anyone realized what had happened. And without knowing the vehicle, investigators could not simply draw one line on a map and follow it. They had to consider countless possibilities. Nearby roads, rural areas, properties, businesses, highways, and locations where someone could potentially hide evidence. That is why searches in missing person cases can be so extensive. Investigators are not always searching for something they know exists. Sometimes they are searching because they cannot afford not to. The passage of time makes that problem worse. Imagine searching a location in 1992. Now imagine returning years later. The landscape may have changed. Buildings may have been demolished. Roads may have been altered. Trees may have grown. Property ownership may have changed. A place that looked one way in 1992 may look completely different decades later. Even if evidence once existed, finding it can become increasingly difficult. And yet investigators have continued looking. The case also demonstrates why physical evidence must be preserved. Something that seemed insignificant in 1992 could become valuable decades later. Technology changes. Forensic science develops. Databases grow. A sample that could not produce an identification at one time may become more useful later. But that only works if the evidence still exists and has been properly preserved. That is one reason old evidence can become so important in cold cases. The future may be able to answer questions that the past could not. For the Springfield 3, however, the publicly available official information remains limited. The FBI's current VCAP alert still identifies the 3 women as missing and gives the Springfield Police Department case number 92 to 40,169. It also provides their physical descriptions and asks for additional information. That means the investigation remains dependent not only on physical evidence, but also on people. Someone may know something. Someone may have seen something. Someone may have remembered something years later. And someone may still be able to provide the missing link. There is another uncomfortable possibility. What if the person responsible knew that the house contained very little evidence? What if they understood the environment? What if they knew the women were there? What if they knew how to leave without being noticed? These questions have been discussed in connection with the case. But again, they remain questions. There is no publicly established evidence proving that the person responsible planned the disappearance in advance. There is no confirmed offender, and there is no conviction. The truth is still unknown. That uncertainty has allowed theories to multiply. Some theories suggest an acquaintance. Others suggest a stranger. Some theories focus on the possibility that the women were taken together. Others consider whether one woman may have been the intended target. Some people believe the house contained clues that investigators overlooked. Others believe the most important evidence may have disappeared with time. But none of those theories can provide what the families ultimately need: proof. A theory can explain the mystery. Evidence can solve it, and investigators have been searching for that evidence for more than 3 decades. The house also raises another haunting question. If the women were taken from there, did they know what was about to happen? Did they have time to understand the danger? Did they realize that something was wrong? Or did everything happen so quickly that they had no opportunity to react? Nobody knows. And perhaps that is one of the most painful uncertainties in the entire case. The final moments of 3 people's lives may exist only in the memory of whoever knows what happened. If someone else was responsible, that person may be the only individual who knows the complete story. And if that person has remained silent, the house cannot speak for them. For investigators, the physical evidence could only take the case so far. Eventually, they needed another direction. They needed people. They needed interviews. They needed timelines. They needed someone whose story did not fit. Someone who knew something they should not have known. Someone who changed their account. Someone who remembered a detail that nobody else could explain. That is where the investigation began moving beyond the house. The next step was to examine the people connected to the women. Not because every acquaintance was suspicious, but because someone in that wider circle might hold the key. And over the years, several names would attract attention. Some would become the subject of intense speculation. Others would be investigated and eventually fade from focus. But one of the most important challenges would be determining which information was genuine and which was simply rumor. Because in the Springfield 3 case, the difference between the two could mean everything. Chapter 9. The names that entered the investigation. As the investigation continued, attention naturally moved away from the house and toward the people connected to the 3 women. This was the next difficult step. A house could contain physical evidence, but people contain memories, and memories could be incomplete. They could be mistaken, they could be deliberately hidden, or they could contain the one detail investigators needed. The challenge was determining which was which. Suzanne had just graduated. Stacy had just graduated. They had friends, classmates, acquaintances, and people they had met during the celebrations. Cheryl had her own circle of friends and acquaintances. That meant investigators were not dealing with a small group of people. They were dealing with an entire network, and every person had to be considered carefully. Who had seen the women, who had spoken with them, who knew their plans, who knew where they were staying, who had any reason to be near the Levitt home during the early morning hours. These questions helped investigators narrow the enormous number of possibilities. But narrowing a list is not the same as identifying a killer. One of the most important principles in a case like this is simple. Being connected to a victim does not make someone guilty. A friend is not automatically a suspect. A former boyfriend is not automatically a suspect. A neighbor is not automatically a suspect. Even someone who had an argument with one of the women is not automatically responsible for their disappearance. Investigators have to look for evidence, opportunity, motive, behavior, statements, physical evidence, and inconsistencies. Without those things, suspicion remains only suspicion. As the years passed, however, certain names repeatedly appeared in public discussions about the case. Some names came from legitimate investigative interest. Others came from rumors. And some came from theories created by people trying to solve the mystery themselves. That created another problem. The more famous the case became, the harder it became to separate verified information from speculation. A rumor repeated 10 times can sound more convincing than a fact mentioned once. But repetition does not create evidence. Investigators therefore had to return to the same questions again and again. Where was each person on the night of June 6th? Where were they during the early morning of June 7th? Could they account for their movements? Did anyone see them? Did their story remain consistent? Did anything place them near the Levitt home? These questions might seem simple, but when investigators are dealing with dozens of people and a disappearance window of only a few hours, the process becomes extremely complicated. The timeline was especially important. The FBI's official case information places the disappearance between approximately 2:15 a.m. and 7:30 a.m. on June 7, 1992. That means investigators could ask every person connected to the case, where were you during those hours? For someone who was asleep at home, there might be family members who could confirm it. For someone who was driving, there might be witnesses. For someone who was working, there might be records. For someone who was with friends, those friends could potentially confirm the story. But the farther investigators moved away from the night itself, the harder it became to verify memories. Imagine being asked decades later what you were doing on one particular summer night in 1992. Most people could not reconstruct every hour. They might remember where they went. They might remember who they were with. They might remember something unusual. But ordinary moments disappear from memory. That is why contemporaneous records and independent witnesses are so valuable. Unfortunately, 1992 did not provide investigators with the digital trail that exists today. There was no smartphone location history, no social media activity documenting every movement, no widespread network of private security cameras, no electronic record of every transaction. The investigation had to depend heavily on people and traditional evidence. This also meant that an alibi could be difficult to establish decades later. A person might genuinely remember being somewhere, but could anyone else prove it? Could a receipt confirm it? Could a telephone record confirm it? Could another person confirm it? The difference between memory and evidence becomes extremely important in a cold case. A person saying, "I was somewhere else," is information. Independent evidence showing that person was somewhere else is much stronger. Investigators had to look for that distinction. Then there was motive. A motive can help investigators understand why a crime might have happened. But motive is not required for a person to be responsible. And the absence of a known motive does not prove innocence. In the Springfield 3 case, the possible motive is especially difficult because there were 3 missing women. If all 3 were intentionally taken, investigators had to ask why. Were they all targeted? Or was one person the intended target? If one woman was targeted, why were the others taken? Were they witnesses? Were they simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was the entire group deliberately selected? Each possibility changes the investigation. Consider Cheryl. She was 47. Her life was different from that of her 19-year-old daughter and 18-year-old daughter's friend. If someone wanted to harm Cheryl, what reason could they have had? Was there a personal dispute? A financial issue? A relationship problem? Or something else? Then consider Suzanne. She had just graduated. She was young. Her social world was different. She had friends, classmates, and plans for the future. Who could have wanted to hurt her? And then Stacy. She was 18. She had her own life and relationships. Why would she be involved? These questions demonstrate how difficult the motive problem becomes when 3 people disappear together. There is another possibility. Perhaps the 3 women were not individually targeted at all. Perhaps the offender had another reason for being at the house. Maybe the situation developed unexpectedly. Maybe the women became involved because they happened to be there. Or perhaps the entire disappearance was planned. There is no definitive public evidence establishing which scenario is correct. That is why the case cannot be reduced to one simple explanation. As investigators looked at people connected to the women, relationships became important. A former relationship might reveal a conflict. A friendship might reveal a secret. A casual acquaintance might reveal an unexpected connection. Someone who appeared distant from the victims might actually have known them well. And sometimes investigators discover that people know more about one another than they initially admit. That is why interviews can take time. Investigators do not simply ask, "Did you know Suzanne?" They ask, "How did you know her? When did you last see her? Who else was there? What did you talk about? Where did she say she was going? Did she seem worried about anything? Did she mention anyone? Did she make any plans?" Each answer can create another question. The graduation celebrations were therefore important again. Suzanne and Stacy were surrounded by people that night. Some of those people may have known them well. Others may have barely known them. But someone may have noticed something unusual. Perhaps a conversation. Perhaps an argument. Perhaps a person who seemed unusually interested in where they were going. Perhaps nothing at all. Investigators had to determine which observations mattered. And then there were possible sightings after the disappearance. These are common in missing person investigations. Someone sees a person who resembles the missing individual. A report comes in. Investigators check it. Sometimes the person is completely unrelated. Sometimes the description is wrong. Sometimes the sighting is impossible to verify. And occasionally, a sighting becomes important. The problem is that human beings are not perfect at recognizing strangers from memory. A person may genuinely believe they saw someone. That does not necessarily mean they did. This became especially complicated as the years passed. People wanted answers. The public wanted to solve the mystery. Online discussions grew. Theories spread. Possible suspects were named. Possible locations were discussed. But every theory had to be treated carefully. A person being mentioned online does not make them a suspect. A rumor is not an accusation supported by evidence. and a theory is not a fact. That distinction is especially important when discussing real people connected to an unsolved case. The official FBI position remains straightforward. Cheryl Levitt, Suzanne Streeter, and Stacy McCall are missing. The FBI continues to seek information, and the case remains connected to the Springfield Police Department. That means the investigation has never reached the point where authorities can publicly provide a complete explanation. There is no final official story. There is no confirmed offender. There is no courtroom conclusion. There is only an unanswered disappearance. But over the years, one particular theory began attracting significant attention. It involved the possibility that the women were taken by someone they knew. That theory had a certain logic. If someone familiar came to the house, perhaps the women would not have immediately considered the person dangerous. Perhaps there would have been no reason to panic. Perhaps the person could enter without creating a dramatic confrontation, and if the person knew the neighborhood, they might also have known how to leave. But logic alone cannot solve a crime. Investigators needed evidence connecting an individual to the disappearance. This is where the case became increasingly complicated. A person can appear suspicious without being responsible. A person can have a questionable history without being responsible for this particular crime. A person can know the victims without being responsible, and a person can even lie about something unrelated without being guilty of murder. Investigators therefore have to determine whether a suspicious detail actually connects to the crime. That process can take years, sometimes decades. The Springfield 3 case has endured precisely because that final connection has never been established. There are pieces, there are theories, there are questions, but there is no complete chain of evidence that publicly establishes what happened. And without that chain, the case remains open. Meanwhile, the families continued living with the uncertainty. For them, every theory had an emotional cost. Every possible sighting could create hope. Every failed search could create disappointment. Every new suspect could create another question. And every year without an answer meant another year without closure. The passage of time did not make the disappearance less painful. It only made the mystery older. But there was still one direction investigators could pursue. If someone knew where the women were, and if someone had approached the house, then perhaps that person had also known something about their plans before that night. That meant investigators had to look closely at what the women had been doing in the days and weeks before their disappearance. Their relationships, their routines, their plans, and anything unusual that might have happened shortly before graduation. Because sometimes the final clue in a disappearance does not come from the night someone vanishes. It comes from something that happened before they vanished. And that would become the next question. Was there anything unusual happening in the women's lives before June 7th, 1992? In the days before June 7th, 1992, nothing about Suzanne Streeter, Stacy McCall, or Cheryl Levitt suggested that their lives were about to become the center of one of America's most enduring missing person mysteries. There was no known warning that would clearly explain what was coming. No confirmed threat, no public announcement, no message telling the women to be careful. Just an ordinary period of life, followed by an extraordinary disappearance. And that is one of the most frustrating aspects of the case. When investigators look backward, they are searching for something that may have seemed completely meaningless at the time. A conversation, a disagreement, a person, a strange encounter, a change in routine. Something that, in 1992, appeared ordinary. But after 3 people disappeared, every detail suddenly mattered. Suzanne was 19. She had just reached one of those moments when life begins to change. Graduation meant that school was finished. The people she had spent years around were beginning to move in different directions. Some would attend college. Some would begin working. Some would leave Springfield. Others would stay. The future was opening in front of her. And on June 6th, Suzanne was celebrating that future with her friends. Stacy was doing the same. She was 18. She too had just graduated. The 2 young women had reached the end of their high school years together. The graduation celebrations were therefore not unusual. They were exactly the kind of event people remember for years. Except this time, the memory would eventually be connected to something far darker. The FBI's official account confirms that Suzanne and Stacy attended graduation parties on the night of June 6th, and later returned to Cheryl Levitt's home. That information gives investigators a starting point. But what happened before the celebrations? Were there any arguments? Any threats? Any unusual encounters? Did anyone behave differently around Suzanne or Stacy? Did either woman express concern about someone? Did Cheryl have any problems that could have placed her at risk? These are the questions that investigators naturally have to consider. But there is an important problem. The absence of a documented warning does not mean nothing happened. It simply means there is no confirmed public evidence showing that a particular warning existed. People often imagine that victims in unsolved cases must have known they were in danger. Sometimes that is true, but often it is not. A person may have no reason to believe that anything bad is about to happen. They may go to sleep believing tomorrow will be ordinary. They may make plans for the following week. They may talk about the future. They may laugh with friends. And then something happens that changes everything. That possibility makes the Springfield 3 case especially haunting. There was no known reason for Suzanne and Stacy to expect that their final night would be their last known night. The same was true for Cheryl. She was at home. There is no confirmed public evidence showing that she expected danger. She was simply living her normal life. Her daughter had gone out to celebrate graduation. A friend had joined her. Eventually, the young women returned home. From the perspective of an ordinary night, nothing about that sounds remarkable. That is exactly what makes the disappearance so difficult to understand. Investigators therefore had to examine relationships. Who had conflicts with Cheryl? Who had conflicts with Suzanne? Who had conflicts with Stacy? Who had recently ended a relationship? Who had been rejected? Who had become angry? Who might have known where the women would be? These questions are standard investigative questions. They do not prove anything about any individual. They simply help investigators understand possible motives and opportunities. But motive can be misleading. Sometimes investigators spend enormous amounts of time looking for a reason. Yet a crime can occur without an obvious motive. A person may act irrationally. A person may commit an impulsive act. A person may have a motive that nobody else knows. Or the victims may have been chosen for reasons unrelated to their personal lives. That is why investigators cannot rely only on motive. They need physical evidence, witnesses, records, statements, and connections that can be independently verified. In 1992, many of the tools investigators rely on today simply did not exist. There were no mobile phone location records showing where someone had been every minute. There was no social media documenting a person's movements. There were no smartphones recording photographs with precise timestamps and locations. There were fewer surveillance cameras, and personal digital records were limited. That means the investigators had to reconstruct the past using traditional methods. Interviews, telephone records, physical evidence, witness accounts, vehicles, and memories. Memory can be powerful, but memory can also change. Someone may remember an event differently after 10 years. After 20 years, details can become blurred. After 30 years, a person may remember the feeling of an event without remembering the exact sequence. This does not mean that every old witness is unreliable. It simply means investigators have to compare memories against other evidence. If two independent people remember the same thing, that can be useful. If a memory matches a physical record, it becomes stronger. If a statement changes dramatically over time, investigators may ask why. The graduation night therefore remained important. Suzanne and Stacy were seen by other people. That meant there were witnesses. But witnesses could only account for part of the night. Eventually, the women returned to the Levitt residence. And after that, the number of confirmed details became smaller. This is where the case becomes almost like a missing page in a book. The beginning of the night is known. The ending is known. But the most important section is missing. The FBI's current case information still places the disappearance sometime between approximately 2:15 a.m. and 7:30 a.m. on June 7th. 5 hours, a seemingly small amount of time. But inside those 5 hours may be the entire answer. If investigators could reconstruct those hours completely, they might be able to solve the case. What time did everyone go to sleep? Was anyone awake? Did someone arrive? Did someone leave? Was there a vehicle? Was there a phone call? Was there an argument? Was there a struggle? Did the women willingly leave the house? Or were they forced to leave? Each question represents another missing piece. There is another possibility that investigators must consider in any disappearance. Perhaps something happened before the final night that had not yet been recognized as important. A threat might have been dismissed. A strange person might have been ignored. A conflict might have seemed minor. A relationship might have ended badly. A warning might have been misunderstood. If something like that happened, it could provide context. But there is no definitive public evidence establishing a particular event immediately before the disappearance that explains what happened. That is important. The mystery cannot be solved simply by inventing a hidden warning. Investigators need something real. Over the years, people have suggested many possible explanations. Some believe the women were abducted. Others believe the person responsible may have known them. Some theories focus on the house. Others focus on possible destinations. But every theory eventually reaches the same obstacle. Where is the evidence? Where are the women? What happened to them? Who can prove the answer? Those questions remain. For the families, the uncertainty was devastating. A normal family can make plans. A missing family member changes that. Birthdays become complicated. Holidays become complicated. Family gatherings become painful. Every telephone call can cause a moment of hope. Every unidentified body found somewhere can create fear. Every new piece of information can reopen the wound. And yet the family cannot simply stop looking, because stopping means accepting a final answer that may never have been proven. More than 30 years later, the FBI continues to publish the case. The official alert lists all 3 women and asks anyone with information to contact investigators. That continuing appeal is important. It means the case is not merely a historical mystery. It remains an investigation, and investigators still need information. Perhaps someone remembers seeing the women that night. Perhaps someone remembers seeing a vehicle near the house. Perhaps someone knows something about a person connected to the case. Perhaps someone has carried a secret for decades. Or perhaps the most important evidence is still waiting somewhere to be discovered. A place that has never been searched properly. An object that was overlooked. A record that was forgotten. A memory that has not yet been shared. The hardest part is that the women themselves cannot tell investigators what happened. If Suzanne could speak, she might identify the person who approached the house. If Stacy could speak, she might explain what happened after they returned. If Cheryl could speak, she might tell investigators whether she knew the person responsible. But none of them can. So investigators have had to reconstruct their final hours through everyone and everything left behind. And sometimes the smallest details become the most important. The question therefore became more focused. Not simply, where did the women go? But, who had access to them during the final hours? Who could have known they were at the house? Who could have approached the home without immediately raising suspicion? Who could have left the area afterward? And who might have had a reason to keep silent? Those questions would gradually draw attention towards specific individuals. But one of the greatest dangers in an unsolved case is deciding too quickly that a theory must be true. The investigators had to keep an open mind. They needed to examine every possibility, even the uncomfortable ones, even the ones involving people the victims knew. And eventually, the investigation would become focused on people whose names appeared repeatedly in connection with the case. Some connections were innocent. Some were complicated. Some became the subject of public speculation. And one individual in particular would attract attention because of his relationship to the events surrounding the disappearance. But before examining that person, there was one more thing investigators needed to understand. They needed to know exactly what happened after the women failed to appear the next morning. Because the first people who entered the house, the first people who realized something was wrong, may have seen details that would later become crucial. And that brings us to the moment when concern became panic. The moment when the families realized this was no longer a normal morning. Morning arrived quietly in Springfield. For most people, June 7, 1992, was simply another summer morning. But somewhere on East Del Mar Street, 3 people who were expected to be there were missing. Cheryl Levitt, her 19-year-old daughter, Suzanne Streeter, and 18-year-old Stacy McCall. The previous night had been filled with graduation celebrations. Now the celebration was over, and the women were nowhere to be found. At first, the situation may not have seemed like a crime. People do not always follow the plans they make the night before. Someone might sleep late. Someone might go somewhere without telling others. Someone might decide to stay with a friend. But there was something different about this situation. There were 3 women. They had been together. They had returned to the same house. And then all 3 disappeared. The FBI's official case information states that they were last known to be at Cheryl's home, and that the disappearance occurred between approximately 2:15 a.m. and 7:30 a.m. That meant something had happened during the early morning hours. The question was what? As concern grew, people began trying to locate the women. Friends were contacted. Family members were contacted. Questions began circulating. Where was Suzanne? Where was Stacy? Where was Cheryl? Had anyone heard from them? Had anyone seen them? Had anyone spoken to them after the graduation celebrations? Each question produced another question, and slowly, the realization began to settle in. Something was seriously wrong. The first thing people wanted was an explanation. Maybe the women had gone somewhere together. Maybe they had decided to continue celebrating. Maybe they were sleeping. Maybe there had been some misunderstanding. But as people looked more closely at the circumstances, those explanations became harder to accept. The women had not left behind a clear plan. They were not known to have told people where they were going, and there was no confirmed contact afterward. The situation was no longer simply unusual. It was frightening. The home became the center of attention. Investigators needed to understand what the house looked like that morning. What had been left behind? What had changed? What was missing? What was normal? What was unusual? These questions sound simple, but in an ordinary home, distinguishing between normal and unusual can be extremely difficult. People leave objects wherever they last used them. Doors may be open, lights may be off, clothes may be on furniture, telephones may contain messages. A broken object may have nothing to do with a crime. Investigators had to look at everything without assuming that every detail was important. But there were details that naturally drew attention. The porch light, the answering machine, the vehicles, the belongings, and most importantly, the absence of the 3 women. Each detail became part of the puzzle. None provided the complete answer. That was the problem. A traditional crime scene often contains a sequence. A victim, a weapon, a suspect, evidence connecting them. But this case did not provide investigators with such an obvious chain. Instead, there was an empty house and 3 missing people. The answering machine became especially interesting. A message had reportedly been erased. That meant investigators were potentially missing information from the exact period when they needed it most. A telephone message could have been completely ordinary. It could have been a friend calling, a family member, someone asking about the graduation celebrations, or it could have been something much more significant. There is no definitive public evidence establishing what the erased message contained. And once it was gone, investigators could not simply recover the conversation years later. That missing piece would become part of the mystery. Then there was the broken porch light globe. Again, it was a small detail, but small details can become important when people disappear. Investigators had to ask whether the damage happened before the disappearance. Was it accidental? Was it caused by someone arriving? Could it have been connected to a struggle? Or was it completely unrelated? Without evidence establishing the answer, the broken globe could not solve the case. But investigators could not ignore it either. The vehicles created another problem. The women had not simply disappeared from a highway. They were last known to be at home. That raised questions about transportation. If they left voluntarily, how did they travel? If someone took them, what vehicle was used? Was more than one vehicle involved? Did someone drive them away? Did someone move a vehicle afterward? The possibilities were enormous. And in 1992, investigators did not have the technological tools that are available today. There was no smartphone location history, no widespread GPS tracking, no digital surveillance network, no automatic record of every movement. The investigation depended heavily on witnesses and physical evidence. This meant investigators needed people, someone who had seen the women, someone who had spoken to them, someone who knew their plans, someone who had seen a vehicle, someone who had noticed something unusual around the house. Perhaps a neighbor had seen a car. Perhaps someone had heard a noise. Perhaps someone had been driving through the neighborhood. Perhaps someone had been awake during the early morning hours. The difficulty was that most people would not have known they were witnessing something important. To them, it may have looked like an ordinary night. That is one of the most frustrating aspects of cold cases. A witness may have information without realizing it. A person might remember a vehicle, but not its license plate. They might remember a person standing outside, but not their face. They might remember hearing a sound, but not know where it came from. At the time, there was no reason to pay close attention. Only afterward does the memory become significant. As investigators began gathering information, they needed to reconstruct the previous evening. Suzanne and Stacy had been at graduation celebrations. They had been around other people. They eventually returned to Cheryl's home. Then the timeline became uncertain. That meant investigators could ask, who saw them last? Who spoke with them last? Who knew they were going home? Who knew where the house was? Who had any reason to visit the house? And perhaps most importantly, who could account for their own whereabouts during the disappearance window? These questions would eventually lead investigators into a much larger circle. Friends, acquaintances, people from the graduation celebrations, people connected to the women's personal lives, and people who might have known the family. But at this stage, investigators did not know who mattered. They had to examine everyone. That is how investigations work. You start with possibilities, then evidence removes possibilities one by one. At least, that is what investigators hope will happen. For the families, however, there was no such patience. They wanted the women found. They wanted to know whether they were alive. They wanted to know where they were. And they wanted to know who had taken them, if an abduction had occurred. The emotional difference between a disappearance and a confirmed death is enormous. With death comes finality. With disappearance comes uncertainty. There is always a possibility, however small, that the missing person is alive somewhere. That possibility can keep hope alive for years, but it can also make grieving almost impossible. As the search expanded, photographs of the women became increasingly important. People needed to recognize them. The FBI's official alert identifies all 3 women by name and provides identifying information for the public. The purpose is simple. If someone knows something, they need to be able to connect that information to the correct people. A photograph can trigger memory. A name can trigger recognition. A familiar face can cause someone to remember a meeting from decades earlier. And in a case with so few confirmed clues, even an old memory can matter. But there was still a major problem. No confirmed sighting emerged that explained where the women went. No confirmed message. No confirmed destination. No confirmed account of what happened inside the house. And no confirmed offender. The investigation had begun, but the answer remained far away. As the first days passed, investigators had to consider the possibility of foul play more seriously. 3 people disappearing together was difficult to explain. The FBI continues to list the 3 as missing, with the Springfield Police Department identified as the investigating agency. But a missing person case can involve many possibilities. An abduction, a voluntary departure, an accident, a crime. Investigators could not eliminate possibilities simply because one explanation felt more disturbing than another. They needed evidence, and evidence takes time. The search therefore expanded beyond the house. Investigators examined the surrounding area. They looked for witnesses. They considered possible routes. They followed tips. They attempted to reconstruct movements. Every possible lead had to be evaluated, and every lead that failed created another disappointment. But one thing remained constant. The women had not come home. Imagine being one of the people waiting for them. The first day passes, then another. You expect a phone call. Nothing. You expect someone to find them. Nothing. You begin hearing theories. One sounds hopeful. Another sounds terrifying. You do not know which to believe. And eventually the question changes. At first, where are they? Later, what happened to them? That transition is one of the most painful parts of a missing person investigation. The case would eventually become a long-term investigation. But that morning, nobody knew that. Nobody knew that the names Cheryl Levitt, Suzanne Streeter, and Stacy McCall would remain in the public consciousness for decades. Nobody knew that investigators would continue receiving tips. Nobody knew that people would continue searching for answers. Nobody knew that the case would become one of the most discussed, unsolved disappearances in Missouri. At that moment, there were simply 3 missing women, and someone had to find them. The early investigation, therefore, focused on the most basic questions. What happened? When did it happen? Who was involved? Where did the women go? And could anyone provide information? The first question remained unanswered. The second had been narrowed to a few early morning hours. The third was completely unknown. And the fourth was the biggest mystery of all. Where could 3 people disappear to? The investigators would soon realize that finding the answer might require looking beyond the immediate neighborhood. If the women had been transported somewhere, there might be a route. If there was a route, there might be a vehicle. If there was a vehicle, someone might have seen it. And if someone saw it, that person could potentially break the case open. But before investigators could follow that possibility, they had to understand the people who were closest to the women. Because somewhere among their friends, acquaintances, and connections might be the person who knew something. And one relationship would soon attract particular attention. Not because a connection automatically meant guilt, but because the person connected to that relationship had information investigators needed to examine carefully. The investigation was moving closer to the names that would dominate the case for years. And the next chapter would begin there. Chapter 12. The investigation takes a new direction. As the initial search continued, investigators faced a difficult reality. They had 3 missing women. They had a last known location. They had a narrow window of time. But they still did not have a clear explanation. The case needed direction. And that direction would come from looking more closely at the people surrounding Suzanne, Stacy, and Cheryl. Not everyone connected to the women was suspicious. In fact, most people who knew them were simply friends, relatives, classmates, or acquaintances. But investigators could not afford to overlook anyone who might have information. The question was no longer simply, who knew the women? It became, who knew enough about their plans to find them that night? Suzanne and Stacy had spent the evening celebrating their graduation. That meant dozens of people potentially knew where they had been, but not everyone knew where they planned to go afterward. That distinction mattered. Someone who saw Suzanne at a graduation party might not have known she would eventually return to her mother's house. Someone who knew Suzanne well might have known. Someone who was close to Stacy might have known. And someone who had spoken with either woman late that night might have learned their plans directly. Investigators therefore had to reconstruct the conversations that took place before the women went home. What had they said? Who had they talked to? Who knew where they were going? And did anyone show unusual interest? The problem was that ordinary conversations can become important only after something goes wrong. Imagine telling a friend, "We're going back to my mom's house." At the time, that sentence means almost nothing. It is simply a plan. But after 3 people disappear from that house, the same sentence becomes important. It tells investigators where the women intended to be. It tells them who might have known their destination. And it creates another question. Who else heard it? The investigation therefore began to depend heavily on interviews. People were asked to remember the graduation celebrations, the people present, the conversations, the movements, the vehicles, the times, the departures, and eventually, the moment Suzanne and Stacy left the celebrations. Every detail could potentially help, but interviews also introduced another difficulty. People remember things differently. One person might remember a conversation clearly. Another might not remember it at all. Someone might remember the women leaving early. Someone else might remember them staying later. The investigators had to compare those accounts. And when accounts conflicted, they had to determine why. There was also the question of relationships. Young people often have complicated social lives. Friendships change. Relationships begin and end. Arguments happen. People become jealous. People become angry. Sometimes problems are temporary. Sometimes they become serious. Investigators had to know what was happening in the women's lives without automatically assuming that every disagreement was connected to their disappearance. That meant examining the background carefully, not sensationally, not through rumor, but through evidence. The same applied to Cheryl. She had her own life, her own friends, her own acquaintances, her own history. Investigators had to consider whether anyone might have had a reason to harm her. And if so, whether that person also knew Suzanne and Stacy. The possibility of one person being connected to all three victims was particularly important, because if the women were intentionally targeted together, there might be a connection between them. Something shared, someone shared, or simply the fact that they happened to be together that night. That last possibility is particularly disturbing. What if the women were not connected by a common motive? What if the only thing connecting them was that they happened to be inside the same house? In that scenario, an offender may have intended to confront one person. The other two could have become witnesses. Or perhaps the offender encountered the three unexpectedly. Without evidence, investigators could not know. But these possibilities had to be considered. The FBI's current case information continues to identify all three women as missing and places their disappearance in the early morning hours of June 7, 1992. More than 3 decades later, the basic question has not changed. Where are they? That is the question investigators still need answered. And to answer it, they need to know what happened during those missing hours. As investigators examine the people around the women, certain individuals naturally received more attention. That does not mean those individuals were guilty. It means their connection to the victims or the timeline made their statements worth examining. Investigators might ask, where were you? Who were you with? When did you last see Suzanne? When did you last see Stacy? Did you know they were going to Cheryl's home? Did you speak with anyone afterward? Did you see anything unusual? Did you hear anything? These questions can reveal contradictions, and contradictions can lead to further investigation. But a contradiction does not automatically mean murder. People misremember. People misunderstand questions. People become nervous. People forget. And sometimes people lie about unrelated matters. Investigators have to determine whether the inconsistency is actually connected to the crime. That can be extremely difficult in a case where so much time has passed. The early 1990s also created another problem. There were fewer records. Today, investigators might examine phone location data, digital messages, online activity, security camera footage, electronic purchases, and countless other records. In 1992, most of that did not exist. A person's movements could disappear into ordinary life. A drive across town might leave almost no digital trace. A conversation could happen without being recorded. A meeting could take place without a photograph. A person could leave Springfield without creating an obvious electronic trail. That technological difference is one reason older cases can be so difficult to solve. But investigators still had traditional evidence. Telephone records, witness statements, vehicles, physical evidence, and most importantly, people. People who could say, I saw her. I spoke to him. I remember that car. I was there. I heard something. Those statements could build a picture, but they needed to be tested. And this is where the case began producing competing theories. One theory suggested that the women were taken by someone they knew. Another possibility was that a stranger entered the situation. Some people believed the disappearance was planned. Others thought it might have been spontaneous. Some believed the women were taken together. Others believed one person may have been targeted. Every theory seemed to explain one part of the mystery and create another problem somewhere else. For example, if a stranger was responsible, how did that person know where the women were? If someone they knew was responsible, why was there so little obvious evidence? If one woman was targeted, why were all three taken? If the women left voluntarily, why was there no confirmed contact afterward? If they were abducted, where were they taken? Every answer created another question. That is what makes the case so difficult. Investigators also had to consider the possibility that the person responsible had planned ahead. A planned crime could explain preparation. A vehicle could have been ready. A destination could have been selected. The offender might have known the women's routine. But there is no publicly established evidence proving that the disappearance was planned in advance. It remains a theory, and theories must remain separate from facts. The opposite possibility is equally disturbing. What if nothing had been planned? What if an argument occurred? What if someone became violent? What if the situation escalated unexpectedly? A spontaneous crime, might leave a very different type of evidence. But again, investigators do not have a definitive public reconstruction of the event. There is no confirmed account showing that an argument or confrontation took place. The truth remains unknown. The case therefore moved forward slowly. Names were examined. Statements were compared. Tips were received. Searches continued. And years began passing. At some point, a case like this can become part of a community's memory. People who were teenagers in 1992 become parents. Parents become grandparents. Buildings change. Businesses close. New roads are built. People move away. Yet the photographs of the 3 missing women remain the same. They remain 19, 18, 47, forever connected to the summer morning when they disappeared. The FBI continues to ask anyone with information to come forward. That request is important because the investigation does not necessarily depend on discovering an entirely new suspect. Sometimes the missing piece is a witness. Someone who already knows what happened. Someone who saw something. Someone who heard something. Someone who has remained silent. And after 30 years, investigators still have a reason to believe that information may exist somewhere. But as the years passed, another problem emerged. Public speculation began growing. People started discussing possible suspects and possible explanations. Some theories were based on real investigative information. Others were based on assumptions. And some were simply stories that became popular because they sounded convincing. That made the case harder to understand. The more people talked about it, the more difficult it became to separate the original evidence from everything that came afterward. For investigators, that distinction is critical. A theory can be interesting. A theory can even be logical. But unless evidence supports it, it remains a theory. That is especially important when real people's names are involved. An accusation can follow someone forever. And an unsolved case can create suspicion around people who may have had nothing to do with it. That is why responsible investigators and responsible storytellers must distinguish clearly between established facts, investigative possibilities, and speculation. Eventually, however, one particular individual would become one of the most discussed names connected to the Springfield 3. The person's connection to the case would raise questions. Their statements would attract attention, and their relationship to the events surrounding the disappearance would become part of the larger mystery. But the most important point must be made clearly. Being discussed in connection with an unsolved case does not establish guilt. No conviction has established who killed or abducted the 3 women. The case remains unsolved. And that brings us closer to one of the most important questions in the entire investigation. If someone did come to the house that morning, how well did they know the women? Because if the person was a stranger, investigators needed to explain how they found the women. But if the person was familiar, then the circle of possibilities became much smaller. And somewhere inside that circle might be the person who knows what happened. The next stage of the investigation would therefore focus even more closely on the relationships surrounding the 3 women. Not just who they knew, but who knew them well enough to know where they would be that night. As the investigation continued, one question became increasingly important. Who knew the 3 women well enough to know where they would be that night? That question sounds simple, but in reality, it opened an enormous door. Suzanne had friends from school. Stacy had her own friends. Cheryl had friends, neighbors, and acquaintances from her adult life. And through Suzanne and Stacy's graduation celebrations, dozens of people could potentially have known something about their plans. Investigators had to separate the people who simply knew the women from the people who might have had a meaningful connection to the disappearance. That distinction was crucial. The women had not disappeared from a public street. They had disappeared from a private home. That meant investigators had to consider how someone could have reached them there. If the person was a complete stranger, how did they know the women were inside? If the person was familiar, why would the women allow them inside? And if the person arrived unexpectedly, how could they have removed 3 people without attracting attention? Every possibility created another question. One theory that naturally emerged was that the person responsible may have been known to the women. It is easy to understand why people considered this. If someone you recognize comes to your door late at night, you may not immediately feel threatened. You might open the door. You might invite them inside. You might speak with them. You might assume the visit is harmless. That does not prove that this happened in the Springfield 3 case. It is simply one possibility investigators and observers have considered. But there was another side to that theory. If the women knew the person, then investigators needed to identify people who had relationships with them. Friends, former friends, romantic acquaintances, classmates, neighbors, people from work, people from school, and people who had interacted with them during the graduation celebrations. The list could become very long, and every name required context. Investigators could not simply ask whether someone knew Suzanne. They needed to know how. Had they been close? Had they recently spoken? Had they argued? Had they made plans? Had Suzanne mentioned the person to anyone? Had Stacy known them too? Did Cheryl know them? Did the person know where the Levitt home was? These questions could reveal whether a connection was meaningful or merely superficial. There was also the possibility of jealousy or conflict. Young people can have complicated relationships. Someone may have been interested in one of the women. Someone may have been rejected. Someone may have been angry after an argument. Someone may have felt betrayed. But again, these are possibilities. There is no public evidence establishing that a particular relationship conflict caused the disappearance. And it is important not to turn ordinary relationship problems into accusations. Investigators needed something stronger. They needed a connection between a person and the disappearance itself. A person might have had an argument with Suzanne. That does not prove they were responsible. A person might have disliked Stacy. That does not prove they were responsible. A person might have known Cheryl. That does not prove anything. But if the same person also had an unexplained opportunity to be near the house during the disappearance window, investigators would naturally examine that more closely. That is how suspicion develops in an investigation. One fact alone may mean very little. Several independent facts can become significant. The timeline remains central. The FBI's official information places the disappearance between approximately 2:15 a.m. and 7:30 a.m. on June 7, 1992. That window gave investigators a framework. Anyone who could potentially have been involved had to be examined against that period. Where were they? Who were they with? Could someone verify their location? Did they have access to a vehicle? Did they make any unusual calls? Did they behave differently afterward? These questions were not accusations. They were investigative tools. But as the years passed, the value of some evidence became harder to determine. A person might have had a perfectly ordinary explanation for their movements. But decades later, proving that explanation could be difficult. A friend who could once confirm an alibi might have moved away. A relative might have died. A workplace might no longer exist. A business might have closed. A receipt might have disappeared. And memories could have changed. Time was slowly erasing the supporting details investigators needed. Still, some people remembered. Some people continued talking about the case. And some people developed their own theories about what happened. That is when the case began attracting a much wider public audience. People who had never met the three women began studying the disappearance. They examined photographs. They discussed timelines. They looked at maps. They talked about possible suspects. They tried to reconstruct the final hours. For the families, this attention could be both helpful and painful. Public attention can bring new information, but it can also create rumors. A rumor can begin with something tiny. Someone says they remember seeing a particular vehicle. Another person repeats it. Someone adds a detail. Another person posts the story somewhere else. Years later, people may believe the detail was officially confirmed. But that does not necessarily make it true. This is why the Springfield 3 case requires careful handling. There are many stories surrounding it, but the official facts are much narrower. 3 women disappeared. They were last known to be at Cheryl's home. Their belongings remained. They have never been found, and nobody has been convicted of their disappearance. The FBI continues to list the case as an active missing person investigation and provides identifying information for all 3 women. That official record is important because it gives us a stable foundation. Everything else must be examined against that foundation. One of the most haunting questions concerns the final moments before the disappearance. Were the women asleep? Were they awake? Were they talking? Were they watching television? Were they expecting someone? Was someone already inside? Did someone arrive at the front door? Did a confrontation occur? We simply do not know. And without knowing those details, it is almost impossible to reconstruct the exact sequence. But investigators could still work backward. If someone arrived, how did they get there? If they left with the women, how did they transport 3 people? If a struggle occurred, why was there so little obvious evidence? If the women left willingly, why did they not contact anyone afterward? If the disappearance was planned, why has no confirmed trace emerged? Every possibility has a weakness. That is why the case has resisted resolution. Another question is whether the 3 women were taken at exactly the same time. Perhaps they were, but perhaps something happened to one woman first, then another, then another. If that were the case, the order could be extremely important. Imagine that one person was the intended target. The other 2 might have become involved because they were present. Or perhaps all 3 were intentionally targeted from the beginning. Without knowing the sequence, investigators cannot know which theory best fits. The lack of a confirmed body also changes the investigation. In many homicide cases, the discovery of a victim provides physical evidence. A location, a cause of death, potential forensic evidence, clothing, objects, environmental clues. But in the Springfield 3 case, investigators have never publicly established where the women went. That means they are missing not only as people, but also as potential sources of evidence. Their location could answer countless questions. If they were ever found, investigators might learn how they died. They might discover where they were taken. They might identify evidence linking them to another location. They might find objects that reveal what happened. They might even uncover evidence that changes the entire understanding of the case. That is why finding the women remains so important. The families therefore continue to live with an impossible uncertainty. They cannot fully move forward. They cannot fully go back. Their loved ones remain missing. And somewhere in the world, there may still be information that could change everything. Perhaps someone knows where they were taken. Perhaps someone knows who was responsible. Perhaps someone knows what happened inside the house. Perhaps someone has spent 30 years convincing themselves that staying silent was easier. But secrets do not necessarily disappear. Sometimes they become heavier. Over time, investigators have received tips. Some may have been credible. Others may have been false. Some may have been based on genuine memories. Others may have been speculation. Every tip has to be evaluated. That is another difficult reality of famous cold cases. The more attention a case receives, the more information investigators may receive. But more information does not necessarily mean more useful information. Sometimes it means more noise. Investigators have to find the signal inside it. And eventually, that search led attention toward individuals whose names became particularly associated with the case. One of them had a connection to Suzanne and Stacy. The connection itself was not proof of anything, but it raised questions. Questions about the person's relationship with the women. Questions about their whereabouts. Questions about what they knew. And questions about whether their story matched the known timeline. Those questions would become part of the larger investigation. But there is something important to remember before we move forward. A person being questioned is not the same as a person being charged. A person being investigated is not the same as a person being convicted. And a theory discussed by the public is not the same as an official conclusion. The Springfield 3 case remains unsolved. No publicly established chain of evidence has proven exactly who was responsible. So as we examine the names connected to the case, we have to keep that distinction clear. Because the real mystery is not simply who looks suspicious. The real mystery is who can be connected to the disappearance by evidence. And that is a much harder question. It requires facts, not rumors, not assumptions, not internet theories. Facts. The investigation had started with an empty house. Then it moved toward the people who knew the women. Now it was beginning to focus on the relationships between those people. And one relationship in particular would become a subject of discussion for years. A relationship that placed a particular person within the wider circle of the women. A person who could potentially have known about their movements. A person whose whereabouts would naturally become important. And as investigators continued looking into the case, they would have to determine whether that connection was meaningful, or simply another coincidence in a case filled with them? The mystery was narrowing, but the answer was still nowhere in sight. Chapter 14: Theories, Leads, and the Search for Answers. By now, the investigation had entered a difficult stage. The first urgency had passed. The initial searches had been conducted. The women had not been found, and investigators were left with a case that offered questions far more easily than answers. 3 women had disappeared from one home. Their belongings remained. Their vehicles remained. There was no confirmed explanation for where they went, and there was no person publicly established as responsible. But an unsolved case does not mean an inactive investigation. It means investigators have to keep looking for a connection that has not yet been found. As the years passed, the Springfield 3 disappearance became increasingly well known. The photographs of Cheryl Levitt, Suzanne Streeter, and Stacy McCall continued to circulate. Their names appeared in newspapers, television reports, online discussions, and missing person databases. Every time the case received attention, another possibility could emerge. Someone might remember something. A witness might come forward. A new search location might be suggested. A person might contact authorities with information they had never previously shared. This is one of the few advantages a cold case can have over time. Time can destroy evidence, but time can also change people's willingness to speak. People who were afraid in 1992 may feel differently decades later. Someone who was protecting another person might eventually decide that the secret is too difficult to carry. Someone who was young at the time may grow older and reconsider what they remember. Someone who dismissed an unusual event as meaningless may suddenly realize that it could have been important. And sometimes a person hears about the case years later and realizes, I know something about that night. That kind of information can be extremely valuable. But investigators also have to be careful with old memories. Memory changes. People fill gaps. Stories become mixed together. And when a case becomes famous, people can unintentionally remember details they learned later as though they personally witnessed them. That is why investigators need corroboration. A statement becomes more useful when it can be supported by another piece of evidence. A telephone record, a photograph, a receipt, a witness, a physical location, something independent. This distinction became especially important as theories surrounding the Springfield 3 multiplied. Some theories focused on people close to the women. Others suggested that a stranger may have been responsible. Some focused on the possibility of an abduction. Others questioned whether the women might have left voluntarily. But the official facts remained unchanged. The women were missing. The FBI continued to seek information, and the case remained unsolved. One theory that repeatedly attracted attention was the possibility that the women were taken because of a connection to one particular person. If that were true, investigators would need to determine whether that person had a motive. But motive alone would not be enough. They would need opportunity. They would need a connection to the timeline. They would need evidence showing that the person could have been involved. And ideally, they would need physical or testimonial evidence connecting that person to the disappearance. Without those things, the theory would remain only a possibility. Another theory was that the women may have been taken by someone they knew. This theory has remained interesting because the women were last known to be inside a private residence. A familiar person could potentially approach without immediately creating alarm. But once again, there is no publicly established evidence proving that the person who may have taken them was someone they knew. It is a possibility, not a conclusion. There is also the possibility of a stranger. A stranger could have approached the home for reasons unrelated to the women. Perhaps the person knew the house. Perhaps the person had watched the area. Perhaps they simply encountered the women unexpectedly. But that theory creates another question. How would a stranger know that 3 women were there? And why would the stranger take all 3? Again, there is no confirmed answer. The more investigators looked at the possibilities, the more the same problem appeared. Every theory explained one part, but none explained everything. A good theory must account for the entire timeline. It must explain why 3 people disappeared. It must explain the lack of a confirmed destination. It must explain the belongings left behind. It must explain the absence of contact. And it must eventually lead to evidence. So far, no publicly known theory has accomplished all of that. The search therefore continued. Investigators examined locations. Tips were followed. People were questioned. Possible evidence was reviewed. And the case occasionally returned to public attention. Each time it did, people hoped that this might finally be the moment when something changed. A new witness, a new search, a new forensic technique, a new piece of information. But hope and resolution are two different things. A lead can create hope without producing an answer. For the families, that distinction was painful. Imagine receiving a phone call after years of silence. Someone says they have information. For a moment, everything changes. Could this be it? Could they finally know? Could they finally find Suzanne? Could they finally find Stacy? Could they finally find Cheryl? Then investigators examine the lead. They search. They verify. And sometimes, nothing. The hope disappears again. That cycle can happen repeatedly in a cold case. Still, the families have continued to keep the women's names alive. That matters, because missing people can gradually disappear from public memory. The longer a case remains unsolved, the fewer people remember the original story. But Suzanne, Stacy, and Cheryl have not been forgotten. Their case remains recognized. Their photographs remain available. And their disappearance remains an unanswered question. The official FBI alert provides identifying information for all three women. Cheryl Levitt was 47. Suzanne Streeter was 19. Stacy McCall was 18. All three were last known to be at the Levitt residence in Springfield, Missouri. That information is more than a record. It is an invitation. Someone may recognize them. Someone may remember seeing them. Someone may know what happened. But the investigation also raises an uncomfortable question. What if the person who knows the truth has already been questioned? What if investigators spoke to that person years ago? What if they told a convincing story? What if there was simply not enough evidence at the time? This possibility exists in many cold cases. A person can be interviewed without being identified as the offender. Investigators may not have enough information to recognize the significance of what they say. Years later, another piece of evidence can change the meaning of an old statement. Suddenly, something that seemed insignificant becomes important. That is why old case files can be valuable. A new investigator may read an old interview and notice something that previous investigators did not. A name may appear in several places. A timeline may reveal an inconsistency. A detail may match evidence discovered later. Cold case investigations often involve looking backward with new eyes. The facts may be old. The interpretation can be new. Technology also changes the possibilities. Modern forensic methods can sometimes examine evidence that could not be analyzed decades ago. Databases can compare information across cases. Digital records may reveal connections that were invisible in 1992. And investigative databases allow law enforcement agencies to share information more efficiently. But technology cannot create evidence where none exists. It can only help investigators examine what remains. That is why preserving evidence from the original investigation is so important. And the Springfield 3 case still has another major obstacle. The women have never been found. Without knowing their location, investigators may be missing the strongest potential evidence of all. Their location could reveal the method. The method could reveal the offender. The offender could reveal the motive. And the motive could explain why the women were taken. One discovery could potentially answer dozens of questions at once. That is why searches have always been so important. But searching for three people after decades is extraordinarily difficult. The area to search is enormous. Land changes. Buildings change. People forget. And if someone intentionally concealed evidence, they may have chosen a location that would be difficult to find. A successful search, therefore, requires more than determination. It requires information. A credible tip can transform an impossible search into a focused one. Perhaps someone knows about such a location. Perhaps they heard a story. Perhaps they were told something by someone who is no longer alive. Perhaps they remember a strange comment. Perhaps they remember a vehicle. Perhaps they remember seeing something near the Levitt home. And perhaps they have never realized how important that memory could be. This is why investigators continue asking for information. The FBI's official alert gives the Springfield Police Department case number and contact information for tips. The message is essentially the same after all these years. If you know something, come Come forward. For a family waiting more than 3 decades, even a small piece of information matters. They do not necessarily need a complete confession. They need a location, a name, a document, a memory, a physical object, something that can move the investigation forward. Because one credible lead can change the entire direction of a cold case. And that brings us to one of the most haunting possibilities. What if the truth has been close all along? What if the person responsible lived in Springfield? What if they knew the women? What if they watched the investigation unfold? What if they saw searches being conducted? What if they listened to news reports? What if they watched the families continue searching? And what if they have spent decades living with the knowledge of what happened? There is no public evidence proving that this is the case. But if the disappearance was caused by another person, someone knows the truth. That fact alone is chilling. The case therefore remains suspended between hope and uncertainty. The women could still be found. A witness could still come forward. Evidence could still be discovered. A new investigative technique could still produce a result. Or a person who has remained silent could finally speak. Until one of those things happens, the mystery remains. And perhaps the most powerful question is not, who did it? Not yet. The first question is, where are they? Because without that answer, investigators cannot fully reconstruct what happened. Without that answer, families cannot receive certainty. Without that answer, every theory remains incomplete. And without that answer, the Springfield Three remain exactly what they were on that morning in 1992. 3 women who disappeared, 3 lives interrupted, 3 families waiting for answers. But the story does not end there. Over the years, certain locations would attract attention. Some would be searched because of tips, others because of theories, and some because investigators believed they might contain evidence. One particular possibility would eventually become especially haunting. A place where people began to wonder whether the women might have been taken. A location that raised questions about whether the case could finally be solved. And that would bring the investigation into one of its most important phases. The search for where the 3 women might have been taken. As the years passed, investigators had to confront one of the most difficult questions in the entire case. If the 3 women were taken from the Levitt home, where could they have been taken? The question sounds straightforward. In reality, it opened an almost limitless number of possibilities. Springfield sits within a large network of roads and surrounding communities. Someone leaving the city could travel in several directions, and after enough time had passed, almost any location could become a theoretical destination. But investigators could not search everywhere. They needed a reason, a tip, a witness, a connection, something that could narrow the possibilities. That is one of the greatest challenges in a missing person case. Finding someone in the first few hours is one thing. Finding someone decades later is completely different. The original scene may no longer look the same. A wooded area may have changed. A building may have been demolished. A property may have changed owners. A road may have been rebuilt. And evidence that once existed may have been destroyed by weather, construction, animals, or human activity. Time does not simply make a case older. It changes the world around the case. Still, investigators continued to search. Some searches were based on information received from the public. Others were connected to theories about what may have happened. And some searches were conducted because investigators believed a location might contain evidence. But a search is not proof. A location being searched does not mean authorities knew the women were there. It means investigators believed the possibility was important enough to examine. That distinction is crucial. Over the years, stories circulated about possible locations where the women might have been taken. Some focused on rural areas. Others focused on properties. Some theories involved places that were difficult to access. And because the women were never found, every credible possibility had to be taken seriously. Imagine being an investigator receiving a tip saying, "I believe the women were taken to this location." You cannot simply ignore it. You also cannot immediately assume it is true. You have to determine, why does this person believe that? How did they get the information? Can it be independently confirmed? Is the location connected to the women? Is there evidence supporting the claim? Only after those questions can a search become meaningful. This is where cold case investigations become painstaking. One lead can consume days. Another can consume weeks. A search can require planning, equipment, personnel, permissions, and forensic specialists. And sometimes after all of that, nothing is found. That does not necessarily mean the tip was malicious. The person may have genuinely believed they were helping. They may have misunderstood something. They may have remembered incorrectly, or the evidence may simply have been gone. The families, however, experience these searches differently. For them, a search means hope. If investigators are searching somewhere, maybe the women will finally be found. Maybe there will finally be an answer. Maybe they will finally know what happened. But if the search ends without results, the family is left with the same question. Were they? That cycle of hope and disappointment can continue for years. The disappearance also raises another difficult possibility. What if the women were moved more than once? If someone intentionally wanted to hide 3 people, they might have chosen a temporary location before moving them somewhere else. Again, there is no publicly established evidence proving that happened, but investigators have to consider possibilities like this when searching for missing people. A location may not be the final destination. It may only be part of the journey. Transportation becomes especially important here. 3 people are difficult to move without some form of transportation. A vehicle would likely have been involved if the women were taken far from the home. That creates another potential line of investigation. What vehicles were available? Who had access to them? Who was driving during the relevant hours? Did anyone notice a vehicle leaving the neighborhood? Did any vehicle appear somewhere unusual? Did anyone suddenly change their behavior afterward? These questions can sometimes help investigators reconstruct movements. But again, the passage of time makes answers harder to obtain. In 1992, there was no modern network of automatic license plate readers. There was no smartphone GPS. There was no Google Maps timeline showing where a person's phone had traveled. There was no digital trail following someone from one location to another. If a vehicle left Springfield in the early morning, there might be almost no surviving record of that journey. That is one reason the case has remained so difficult. The world in which the disappearance occurred was far less digitally documented than the world we live in today. But there were roads, there were gas stations, there were businesses, there were homes, there were people awake at unusual hours, and there were drivers. Someone may have seen something. The difficulty is knowing what to look for. A person might remember a vehicle only after learning about the case. A driver might remember seeing a car, but not know why it mattered. A person working a night shift might remember a strange encounter. Someone traveling early in the morning might have seen people or a vehicle without realizing their significance. That is why public appeals remain important. The FBI continues to list the 3 women as missing and asks anyone with information to contact investigators. That request is not limited to people who know exactly what happened. Someone does not need to have witnessed the disappearance. They may simply possess one piece of information: a conversation, a location, a photograph, a vehicle, a name, a memory. Sometimes investigators can build the larger picture from a very small piece. There is another possibility that cannot be ignored. What if someone deliberately concealed the women somewhere that would not immediately attract attention? A remote property, a secluded area, a place connected to someone who knew the region. If that were the case, investigators would need very specific information to find it. And if the person responsible knew the area well, they might have chosen a location precisely because it was difficult to search. Again, this is only a possibility. There is no confirmed public evidence identifying such a location, but it demonstrates why the search is so difficult. As the years passed, new technology offered some hope. Forensic science continued advancing. Search techniques improved. Databases expanded. Investigators became better at connecting cases. And evidence that might have been meaningless in 1992 could potentially become useful decades later. This is why cold cases are never necessarily finished. A case can remain quiet for years and then suddenly change because of one discovery. A DNA result, a new witness, a forgotten document, a confession, a location, or an old piece of evidence that suddenly makes sense. The Springfield 3 case remains an example of that possibility. The women have not been located. No definitive public explanation has been established. But the investigation remains part of the official missing person system. Their names are still there. Their photographs are still there. Their descriptions are still there. And the request for information remains. For the families, however, the passage of time creates another painful reality. The people who knew the women personally are growing older. Some have died. Some may have forgotten details. Some may no longer be able to provide testimony. That means the window for solving the case does not remain open forever. Every year matters. Every credible memory matters. Every surviving piece of evidence matters. And perhaps somewhere there is a person who knows more than they have ever said. Maybe they were involved. Maybe they witnessed something. Maybe they heard something from someone else. Maybe they were told a secret. Or maybe they know nothing at all but possess one small memory that could connect two pieces of the puzzle. That person may not realize the value of what they know until someone asks the right question. That is why investigators continue to revisit old cases. Not because they enjoy reopening painful stories, but because people change, technology changes, evidence changes, and sometimes the truth becomes easier to see after enough time has passed. A cold case is not necessarily a dead case. It is a case waiting for the missing piece. But there was still another problem. The more famous the Springfield 3 became, the more theories surrounded them. People began attaching names to the case. Possible suspects, possible witnesses, possible locations, possible motives. Some theories were based on genuine information. Others were built entirely from speculation. And eventually, separating the investigation from the mythology surrounding it became almost as difficult as solving the disappearance itself. That distinction is especially important because real people are involved. The three women were real. Their families were real. Their friends were real. And anyone accused without evidence is also real. A mystery may be fascinating, but an unsolved crime cannot be treated like a fictional story where every suspicious character must have a hidden role. There may be innocent people who were simply unlucky enough to become connected to the case. There may also be people who know more than they have admitted. The challenge is determining which is which. The search therefore continued, not with certainty, not with a single theory, but with questions. Where did the women go? How were they transported? Who knew they were at the house? Who had access? Who saw them last? Who remembers something unusual? And where could evidence still exist? For more than 30 years, none of those questions has produced the final answer. But that does not mean the answer does not exist. Somewhere the truth is real. The women either left the house voluntarily or they were taken. They either survived for some period afterward or they did not. Someone either knows what happened or the evidence still exists somewhere. The mystery is not supernatural. It is a real event with a real explanation. The problem is that investigators have not yet been able to prove that explanation. And perhaps the most haunting thought is this. 3 women entered the Levitt home after celebrating graduation. They never emerged in any confirmed way. Their families kept waiting. Investigators kept searching, and the years continued passing. 1992 became 1993, then 2000, then 2010, then 2020, and now, more than 3 decades later, their disappearance remains unresolved. But the story of the Springfield 3 does not end with the passage of time, because as the years went on, the case continued attracting new attention, new investigators, new technology, new theories, and new searches. Some of those searches would focus on places that had already been considered before. Others would be based on information that surfaced much later. And eventually, investigators would have to ask another difficult question. Could the answer have been hidden in plain sight all along? That question would keep the case alive, and it would lead to another chapter in the search for Cheryl, Suzanne, and Stacy. The years continued to pass. But for the families of Cheryl Levitt, Suzanne Streeter, and Stacy McCall, time did not bring an ending. It only made the questions older. Where were they? What happened inside the house? Who was the last person to see them? And why did 3 people disappear without leaving behind a clear explanation? The Springfield 3 case had become a cold case, but it had never become an unimportant one. The FBI still lists all 3 women as missing and continues to seek information about their disappearance. For investigators, one of the biggest challenges remained the lack of a confirmed final destination. If the women had been taken somewhere, that location could potentially answer almost everything. It could reveal what happened after they left the house. It could provide physical evidence. It could establish a timeline. It could potentially identify the person responsible. But without that location, investigators were forced to work from fragments. And fragments are difficult. A single clue rarely solves a case. A series of clues can. The problem is finding the connection between them. Over the years, investigators and members of the public have considered countless possibilities. Some focused on people, some focused on locations, some focused on the events of graduation night. Others focused on what may have happened inside the Levitt home. But every theory eventually encountered the same obstacle. There was no definitive evidence proving what happened. That distinction has remained important for more than 3 decades. The case also demonstrates how difficult it can be to investigate something that happened before modern technology became part of everyday life. Today, investigators might have access to phone location data, security cameras, digital messages, online activity, electronic transactions, photographs with precise timestamps. In 1992, most of those things did not exist. A person could travel across a city without leaving a digital trail. A conversation could happen without a record. A vehicle could disappear down a road without a camera capturing it. And a person's location could become nothing more than someone's memory. That makes the passage of time especially cruel. But technology has also created new possibilities. Modern forensic science can sometimes revisit old evidence. Investigators can compare information across databases. Old records can be digitized. Evidence can be re-examined. And cases that once seemed impossible can sometimes be solved because technology reveals something investigators could not see decades earlier. That possibility remains important, because a cold case does not necessarily require a brand new piece of evidence. Sometimes an old piece of evidence becomes meaningful when examined in a new way. Imagine a clue sitting in an evidence room for 30 years. For most of that time, it appears useless. Then a scientific method improves. Investigators examine the item again. Suddenly, there is a result. A name, a connection, a location, a piece of DNA. One discovery can change everything. That is why investigators continue preserving and reviewing evidence from old cases. But the Springfield 3 case has another source of potential evidence. People. Someone who was alive and present in Springfield in 1992 may still remember something. A person who was young then may now be much older. A memory that seemed insignificant at the time may now appear different. Someone may remember a vehicle. Someone may remember seeing one of the women. Someone may remember a conversation. Someone may remember a person acting strangely. And someone may know something that they have never reported. Sometimes silence has an explanation. People may be afraid. They may believe they will not be believed. They may think the information is too old to matter. They may worry about getting someone else into trouble, or they may simply assume that investigators already know. That is why public appeals often emphasize that even small information can be useful. A witness does not need to know the entire story. They may only know one part. The FBI's official alert continues to provide contact information for the Springfield Police Department and requests information regarding the 3 women. That means the case still depends on the possibility that someone somewhere knows something that investigators do not. There is also another possibility. The person responsible may have died. If that happened, they would never be questioned. They would never confess. They would never explain what happened. And whatever they knew might have disappeared with them. But even if an offender dies, evidence can remain. A document, a photograph, an object, a location, a statement made to another person. Sometimes people confess before they die. Sometimes they tell someone what they did. Sometimes family members discover information years later. And sometimes a secret emerges accidentally. This possibility gives cold case investigators another reason to continue. The person responsible does not necessarily have to be alive for the case to be solved. Evidence can speak for someone who no longer can. But the biggest question remains the same. Why 3 women? That question has never had a definitive public answer. Cheryl was Suzanne's mother. Stacy was Suzanne's friend. The 3 were together at the same residence. Was that simply coincidence? Or was there a reason they were all targeted? If one woman was the intended target, who was it? If all three were targeted, why? And if none of them were specifically targeted, what brought the offender to the house? There is no confirmed answer, and that uncertainty has produced decades of speculation. But perhaps the simplest explanation is also the most difficult to prove. The women may have been taken because they happened to be together. One person may have arrived for one reason. The situation may have changed, and suddenly, 3 lives were caught inside the same event. If that happened, investigators would need to understand the first interaction. Who was the first person approached? Who opened the door? What was said? What happened next? Those moments could contain the key. Another question concerns the house itself. Was there a sign that someone had entered? Was anything disturbed? Was anything missing? Was anything damaged? Some details associated with the home have been discussed publicly over the years, including the broken porch light globe and the erased answering machine message. But neither detail provides a confirmed explanation of the disappearance. They are pieces of an incomplete puzzle. And incomplete puzzles can be dangerous, because the human mind naturally wants to connect the pieces. Sometimes we connect them correctly. Sometimes we create a picture that was never really there. Investigators have to resist that temptation. That is why the case has remained open. An open case means investigators have not reached a final conclusion. It does not mean they have no theories. It means they do not have enough evidence to turn a theory into an established answer. That distinction can be frustrating, but it is necessary, especially when the lives and reputations of real people are involved. For the families, however, the lack of a conclusion is devastating. A missing person's family does not receive the certainty that comes with a funeral. There is no grave, no final moment, no confirmed explanation. Instead, there is an empty space, a place at the table, a photograph, a birthday that passes without an answer, a holiday that brings back memories, and the constant question, what if? What if they were found? What if someone remembered something? What if a new search discovered something? What if someone finally confessed? What if a piece of evidence had been preserved? What if the person who knows the truth finally decided to speak? Those possibilities are what keep cold cases alive. The Springfield 3 have been missing for more than 30 years, but their disappearance remains part of the official record. The FBI continues to publish the case. The Springfield Police Department remains associated with the investigation, and the public continues to be asked for information. The women are not simply names from an old story. They were daughters, friends, mothers, graduates, people with plans, people who expected to wake up the next morning. And then those plans stopped. The passage of time can make a disappearance feel distant. But imagine the opposite. Imagine freezing one ordinary night. The graduation celebrations, the laughter, the conversations, the drive home, the house, the early morning. Then imagine everything suddenly stopping. That is what happened to their families. The world continued, but their story did not have an ending. And perhaps that is why this case continues to attract attention. There is no dramatic courtroom conclusion, no confession, no confirmed crime scene far away, no final photograph, no grave, only the unanswered disappearance of 3 people, 3 women who were last known to be together, 3 lives that suddenly vanished, and a question that has survived every passing year. Where are the Springfield 3? The investigation may one day answer that question. It could happen through a witness, a forensic discovery, a new search, a forgotten record, or information that someone has carried silently for decades. Until then, the case remains open, and the families continue waiting, not for a theory, not for another rumor, but for the truth.